Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is an everlasting flame in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 4, Azure Gleam Rendezvous at Dawn. Hey, Dimitri. Been a while, hasn't it? It had not, but he refrained from saying so. I wanted to discuss the war a bit. Got some time for me? Is something the matter, Claude? Meeting up was significantly easier now that their respective bases were placed closer together. Claude only had to traverse a few days instead of around a week in enemy territory. Claude pouted, giving him a truly wounded look. Had it been Dimitri's first time seeing it, he would have been concerned. Oh, Dimitri, do you not care about me anymore? I spend so much time out of my busy schedule to come see you, and you don't even ask about the kids? I bet you've been seeing some woman from Albania. Tell me her name. Crocodile tears began to pour down Claude's face, and had Dimitri not found it so terribly amusing, he would have sighed. Regardless, Claude managed to evoke a laugh from him, and his entire mood lifted just from the man's presence. It truly is good to see you, Claude. Come, let us talk in privacy. Leading the man into his tent, Dimitri tried to make everything as welcoming as possible. While he had the largest space out of anyone by far, he often didn't know what to do with it, and he spent most of his nights at the training grounds regardless. You know, Dimitri, if you bring me into your tent like this, some rumors you don't want might start spreading. I'm not the most popular guy around. Claude remarked casually as he made himself comfortably in front of Dimitri's tea set. Dimitri scoffed. Let them speak. Regardless of what they think of you, you have always been a friend of mine. If your exemplary results don't sway them, then nothing will. It is best to ignore those who give you grief, I find. Claude gave a short laugh. Nice way of dressing it up, Your Highness, but you don't have to put on any airs here. It's just the two of us. You can speak your mind, honest. I can take it. Dimitri paused in his preparation of the tea, turning to face Claude in his entirety. I am being entirely serious, Claude. You're someone precious to me. Claude blinked, maintaining eye contact for only a few short seconds before leaning back and twirling an arrow between his fingers. Ha, you're something else sometimes, Dimitri. He found himself more befuddled than anything. Is that statement so strange? Even if we have not had much time to speak, you're one of the people I cherish, and it would pain me to lose you, despite not knowing whether the future will drive a wedge between us. Ah, I suppose I agree with your earlier statement, then. There is no need to put on airs between us since the future can change at any time. It is best to speak our minds now. Do you not agree? Claude seemed to be a bit more in control of himself. Is this some ploy to get me to spill all of my secrets, Dimitri? You know I'm not that easy. He rolled his eyes. Claude, you speak of trust often, and yet you fail to consider that although I give my trust unconditionally, you do not have to trust me in return. I do not want an ill-begotten secret from you, or anything of the sort. I wish to talk to and be friends with you, even outside of this war, but if you do not wish the same, then we can simply remain as we are. Claude looked terribly conflicted for a moment before it was covered up by his usual impassive mask. Was there a beast, he wondered, cowering deep within Claude's soul, bloodied, bruised, beaten, or battered? Would it emerge when coaxed, or was it tame? Did it hiss when Dimitri reached for it, smelling the blood on his hands and shrinking away? Was it even possible for them to become closer and speak as friends? Claude was a riddle wrapped in an enigma, and he kept people just far enough away to hit them with fail not. Could that impassable distance be breached by any man, woman, or child? Did he even want to breach it? Claude was a subject in fascination, but was it worth the effort all for Claude to learn of Dimitri's beastly nature? Perhaps he should have the trust in Claude that he spoke of earlier. Despite his own nature, the other man was still just that, at the end of the day, a man. He could decide whether the beast was something even worth considering offering friendship to. Perhaps sensing Dimitri's darkening thoughts, Claude offered a placating hand and spoke calmly. Let's table this discussion for another day, shall we? It's not that I don't want to trust you, it's just that I can't. Not until this war is over. Not until the war is over. That seems to be their motto these days. The war had been waging for less than 3 years, and he could already feel the weight of loss and promises hanging around his neck. I understand, Claude. It is difficult for us to connect beyond mutual understanding when we may be enemies by the end. I do not wish to kill you, is all, and, he couldn't finish the thought. He had spoken into life the words the two did not wish to share, and the air became tense, filled with a sort of static that felt almost tangible. Claude swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. The tea kettle shrieked, and Dmitri quickly set to work serving it. If it helps, Dmitri, I don't want to kill you, either. He gave a short smile. Knowing that does set my heart at ease. I do not want our circumstances to define us. Claude let out a short laugh, the arrow in his hand suddenly stopping its spin. As Dmitri poured the tea, Claude watched his hands intently. Had their conversation not been so tense, perhaps he would have noticed. The arrow flicked out of Claude's hands and sank into the ground of the tent, almost causing Dmitri to jump. Had he been more of a cautious man, he would have made a scene, or perhaps reacted poorly, but here in the middle of his camp, with someone he considered a friend, he felt safe. Oops, clumsy me. Sorry about that, Dmitri, don't mind me. Claude pitched himself forwards and out of the chair to retrieve his arrow, holding onto the table for support. Dmitri watched him, somewhat amused, before placing the tea kettle back onto the burner, now cooled off. When he looked back, Claude was back in his chair, twirling the arrow once more without a care in the world. They were terribly quiet for a moment as neither knew what to say or how to approach the tense atmosphere Dmitri had accidentally created. The tea sat in front of them, rapidly cooling in the cool Fairgus air. Claude even seemed to be sweating, ever so slightly. He imagined it was from the social situation why, even Dmitri felt like sweating. Eventually, however, he had to settle on a topic somewhere. Did you have any trouble getting into the camp? I gave the guards explicit directions to turn their weapons away if you approached, but No, everything was fine and dandy. A-okay, really, you shouldn't worry about me. I don't think anyone even saw me come in, to be honest. Claude laughed, and Dmitri frowned. That won't do. I want to give you a warm welcome whenever you visit. You did, after all, mention how much you enjoyed large feasts the last time we talked. Claude's laugh this time was much more brittle. You remembered that, huh? You remember anything else, by chance? His words sounded almost desperate. Dmitri raised an eyebrow before continuing. We were both quite inebriated, so I must admit my memory of that night was not perfect. Regardless, I remember you sharing some stories of your childhood with me on the terrace. That was just a small tidbit within those stories. Ah, Dmitri, you're gonna make me blush. Any more of that and you're gonna make me think you care. Of course I care. You're someone worth remembering, after all. Dmitri, as is par for the course by this point, completely missed the almost open-mouthed stare that Claude gave him, mainly because he was staring straight down into the tea with a frown. Ah, my apologies, Claude. I'm afraid that my jabbering has kept us from the tea. Let's drink before it gets any colder. Wait. Claude suddenly called, and Dmitri paused with the cup halfway to his mouth. Staring at Claude, he suddenly realized that he had never seen the man scramble for words in a social setting before. It was truly a sight to behold, and one that he would engrave in his mind forever, as he doubted that he would get to see it again. Shouldn't we say grace before we drink? His eyebrow climbed further. That was what he wanted to say? Claude, I don't think I've ever said grace before drinking tea in my life. It's a Lester thing, you know? We do it all the time. Come on, say grace with me. Despite his somewhat apparent attitude towards the goddess, Claude almost immediately clasped his hands together in prayer and closed his eyes. Less than half a second later, he opened one eye to peek at Dmitri, who only looked absolutely unimpressed. I must admit, I've heard nothing about this from, well, anywhere, really, but I suppose if we must. Silently, Dmitri set his cup down and began to pray. He did not have much to pray for, especially given how impromptu the notion was. All he wished for was that his time with those he loved could continue, and that his alliance with the new federation would last. When he opened his eyes, Claude was apparently finished with his prayer and was looking like he was trying far too hard to be natural. When he grabbed the cup again, Claude's voice rang out at a slightly higher pitch than before, a certain edge to it that definitely wasn't there before. So, Your Majesty, what did you wish for? For the umpteenth time, Dimitri sighed and lowered his cup. Please, Claude, there's no need for formality, especially when it is just the two of us. Just Dimitri is fine. You've refused to hold back in calling me that in even formal settings, so there's certainly no need for it now. As for what I wished for, well, it may seem silly, but I wished for my friends to live and that our alliance could continue. Claude was silent for a long moment before wetting his lips and speaking. You did, huh? Is that so unbelievable? There is little more I could wish for. Perhaps I should have also wished for the war to end sooner. No, I'm all for the alliance continuing. That's why I'm here today, after all. Claude's smile had not left his face in the last 3 minutes. It was starting to get unsettling. Finally, Dimitri abandoned the cup and decided to get right to the heart of the matter. Claude, you are behaving strangely. Is something the matter? We can postpone this discussion for later if you aren't feeling well. Nope. Everything's fine. Claude said, despite visibly sweating and staring very intently at some point below Dimitri's eyes. He glanced down, just to see if there were perhaps some defect in his armor that he had failed to notice or a stain from the tea that was likely now completely cold, but there was nothing. When he looked up, Claude had one hand on Dimitri's teacup and was standing up, his body in perhaps the most uncomfortably bent position he had ever seen Claude be in. Hey, just wondering, what tea do you drink, Your Majesty? If Dimitri was suspicious before, he was downright bewildered now. It's chamomile, the same as yours, Claude. I poured it from the same kettle and gave us both the same blend. I apologize if you don't like it, but it's all I had on hand. Claude rose back up, still holding his teacup. Nope, it's all fine here. This tea sure is tasty. Dimitri watched as Claude discreetly poured the tea away from his body and directly into the carnivorous plant that Bernadetta had given him some few moons ago. He watched it shrivel up and die in seconds with abject horror. Was his tea truly that terrible? Now he understood why Claude didn't want him to drink it. Lacking a sense of taste must have put his friends through more horrors than he realized if his tea had that effect on a plant. I see. How could he recover from this social blunder? Claude coughed, sitting back down and still holding steadfastly to Dimitri's cup. So, anyways, the war. Right. Let's talk about the war. Relief filled him. Yes, you're right, the war. Claude had never botched an assassination this badly before in his entire life. See, Dimitri wasn't really supposed to act like that. What Dimitri was supposed to do was go, I'll kill you for threatening Ria, or something like that, and Claude was going to swoop in and kill him quietly before they ever made the pact. Nice, easy, simple. But then they had met, and he had looked him directly in the eyes and starting spouting junk about how he believed that people should be equal, and how he didn't really like the crest system, and how people shouldn't be tied to their circumstances, and suddenly the Federation and Kingdom were in an alliance that he had informed nobody about, including himself, and the surprise package that he had sent the Kingdom was now about him losing 3 of his most trusted commanders and a detachment of soldiers instead of taking down their disorganized camp. So, understandably, Claude was a little rattled right now. That was why he had come here today, too. He was absolutely going to kill Dimitri. Definitely. He had brought a specialty blend poison built to kill the man, with enough harmful stuff in it to take out a demonic beast. It was all going well. Claude had broken in without alerting anyone, got into the camp, and found where Dimitri slept in the early hours of the morning. He was going to poison the water in his tent, and when Dimitri drank it, he would die, and Claude could kill Ria before things got complicated and the other man could feasibly get to her side and defend her. Honestly, out of the entire Kingdom army, nobody scared him as much as Dimitri. The man was crazy strong, and Claude wasn't deluded enough to believe that he could beat him in a fair fight. The man had gone toe-to-toe with Edelgard, who held an undoubtable advantage over him, and he won. Then, he had somehow managed to procure a silver tongue out of nowhere and convince Claude into doing things that he had never intended to do. See, his plan was perfect, but it really failed to account for the fact that Dimitri was awake. When they made eye contact, Claude had almost frozen, and Dimitri had invited him in for a nice cup of tea. He had stammered out some excuse about the war, and into the tent they went. The conversation that followed was perhaps the largest roller coaster of emotions that he had ever been on. By all rights, the fact that Dimitri trusted him fully should have made poisoning him that much easier. In fact, it did make poisoning him easier. He had slipped that tiny bag into the mix with Dimitri none the wiser, and within a few seconds, it was primed and ready to take down a particularly large elephant. The issue was the absolutely kind face that Dimitri had given him when he told Claude that he trusted him unconditionally, that Claude wasn't required to trust him back. And, the more he spoke, the less that Claude saw him as a pawn he could use or a king standing in the way, and the more he just saw Dimitri. That earnest boy from their halcyon days at the academy was still there. He had grown a bit, changed a lot, but it was still unequivocally him. The way he spoke of all his ideals almost made Claude choke on the words in his throat, forced him to hold back his secrets out of sheer fear, because what if I lose that trust, what if he learns my real name and hates me, what if? So many what-ifs blasted through his head in a single instant, and then he saw Dimitri raising his cup to his lips, and sheer, unadulterated panic infiltrated his entire system and decided that it was going to park there. Desperately, he had gone for damage control, unsure if he really wanted to stop this, aware that Dimitri could get in his way, aware that the man before him could easily be the biggest of his problems by far if they won, aware that things would never end at just Edelgard or this new guy Thales. And yet, every time that cup went near his lips, Claude's heart stopped, and he clamored to fix it. Eventually, he decided to just take it from him. He grabbed it, pretended to drink, and poured it out. He knew he fucked up the pour. Dimitri watched him as he realized that he fucked up the pour. Not once before in his life had he ever felt such abject humiliation before. Never had he been brought low by his own emotions like this before. It had never happened. He wasn't an emotional kid, but he wasn't stunted, either. It was so strange. He had never had someone to trust. Sure, there were undoubtedly people that he could place his trust in. His previous friends in the Golden Deer were examples of this. They were people he could turn to if he needed help, and he called them friends easily, but if he said that he absolutely trusted them, the answer would be a resounding no. He had too many secrets, too much baggage, the weight of a continent and a half on his shoulders, and there was nobody he could ask to help carry the weight for him. He was Atlas, standing alone at the top of a molehill of corpses, and he was ready to make it into a mountain. All for his beliefs. All for the slim chance for a better future. All for the pipe dream that Fodlan and Almira, and Srang, and Dada, and all of the rest of the world could overcome their differences and just see each other. But then Dimitri had come and he had seen the weight he held. Claude wasn't sure how, but just from the look in Dimitri's eyes, he could tell that the other man knew. He was aware, in some capacity, of the sheer weight that had been placed on his shoulders. All of the secrets that he held were still clutched tight to his chest, but now, there was someone who he wouldn't mind spilling them to. Until he was ready, he would clutch them tight, but who knows? One day he may trip, and they'll go flying everywhere. Who knows when Shahid would attack next? It was only a matter of time, and things would only get more complicated from there. He had already shared more than he was comfortable with. Dimitri knew a fraction of his life story, and that was already enough to send his chest into a frenzy and his heart into overdrive, sheer panic dominating his entire being. But, somehow, when Dimitri had looked into his eyes and offered that hand, when he spoke of trust and togetherness and all the ideals that Claude never dared to speak aloud, it felt like he finally had something. All Claude wanted was someone to help hold the weight. Someone whom he could trust to help make the world a better place, someone who could bear the weight of his secrets with him. Dimitri wasn't that person, not yet, anyways. Dimitri had seen that weight, and instead of sharing the weight, he had given Claude broader shoulders to carry it with. Knowing that his goals were shared, knowing that it wasn't just an ideal held by a silly boy who dared to stare at the stars and dream, that made everything seem so much more manageable. It made him feel like he wasn't alone in the world, like there was someone who could be a true ally. It made him want to trust. And that scared him. It scared him so badly when he saw Dmitri go to drink the poisoned tea. It scared him because he knew that nothing would be the same. It scared him because he knew that Dmitri would die, and it would be his fault for shredding the last remaining shred of trust left for him in this world. He sat there, his trembling fingers clinging to the cup because he didn't want Dmitri to even take the risk of pouring more tea into it. He didn't know whether it would kill him anymore. The remnants of the poison were probably gone, but they might not be, and if they weren't, he genuinely didn't know what he would do. He'd act like a fool if he had to. This was the first person whom he could comfortably call friend since he had been born, and it would be the first person whom he would mean it for. Isn't that sad? 2 short meetings were enough to dramatically change his viewpoint on the man. How pathetic. He was acting like a scared little boy, clinging to the first person who gave him any attention. Judith would probably chew him out when he got home, again. She was the only one he told the details of his plans to. He felt obligated to, when it came to her. She knew his mother, and since Tiana von Regen wasn't exactly in the picture right now, Judith had decided to take up her role. It would be impossible to explain to her just how he felt. She would quite literally never understand. How could she? His future was the future of 2 nations. If he played his cards right here, he could dramatically alter human history forever. Khalid von Regen, written down in the history books forever. Wouldn't that be something? Maybe the path towards that goal lay over the corpse of the man in front of him. If it did, then was the goal even worth it? Like a dagger cutting its way through the darkness, Dmitri had made Claude realize, one step after another, just what he had to do to accomplish his goals. Protect the weak. Weave together the nations. Defend the present, while creating a brighter future. If only someone like Dmitri had existed earlier. Someone who truly understood the pain that others went through, someone who could manage to hold a haunted look and a dazzling smile at the same time and have neither of them be fake. If someone like that had existed earlier, then perhaps Claude would never have felt the pain that he did, would never have let the weight break his shoulders. Dmitri bought whatever excuse he managed to toss out, playing along with a short laugh and a wave. Talking about the war? Please. He hasn't had any personal stake in this war from the start. If things absolutely go poorly, he'll back out and live the rest of his days as king of another nation. In a way, it's his own prerogative to be here. But it isn't Dmitri's, and it isn't the people of Faerghus, and it isn't the people of Leicester's, and it certainly isn't the people of Adrestia's, and so, here he stands, holding a mildly poisoned cup of tea and throwing all of his carefully constructed plans directly out the window into the trash. So, about the war. I see, so you're suggesting thinning the numbers that Count Berglis will have by placing most of the troops along the Western Front. Dmitri curled his hand around his chin. That may work. Sounds like there's a but in there, my friend. My worry is that the lower number of troops will mean little in the end. You said yourself that Count Berglis is a match for Holstein, Duke Goneril. He has managed to defend Fodlan's Locket for quite some time now, and I would rather not have you repeat Almira's efforts. Would you not like further reinforcements from the kingdom? We have troops to spare, I am certain. Claude gave a small smile, twirling that blasted arrow again. At first, it had been novel, but twice now, he has cut his hands, and next, Dmitri worries, it will be something vital. That's just like you to offer, Dmitri, but no. I think we can manage on our own. Don't worry about me, like I said, I've got a few surprises up my sleeve if I need them. You just focus on keeping that Western Front of yours as active as possible, and we'll keep up our end of the deal. Got it. He frowned, wondering how best to aid his friend. Surely Claude would not be happy if he sent him home with his own reinforcements. It would be in poor taste to send him home with the very golden deer that had been sent as allies. If he did that, it may imply that they had displeased him somehow, or had not been up to his standards, both of which he would rather avoid. Eventually, he struck gold, and he nodded. Understood, Claude. I'll ensure everything goes according to plan. If worst comes to worst, I'll simply hire Geralt's mercenaries. It will be expensive, of course, but I believe that it will be worth it. Claude gave an uneasy laugh. You know, I'm not sure I like that little glint in your eye, but I'll trust you this time. Ah dash. That was progress, was it not? Ultimately, in order for this alliance to function, they must trust each other. If Claude schemed around Dimitri's more basic plans, communication would crumble and everything would come crashing down. In his experience, it was best to be straightforward when unsure of how to deal with someone. Eventually, he found his footing once more. "I'm very glad to hear that, Claude. You saying that doesn't assuage my worries, you know," he retorted, but this time, there was a similar glint in his own eye. Dimitri didn't feel the need to respond, simply holding his hand out. After a long moment, Claude reached out and shook it. "Until next time, friend." Claude's voice was soft, and his easy smile seemed even easier than normal. "Until next time," Dimitri returned the smile without a second thought. With that, Claude broke the handshake and turned to walk away. He got around 5 steps away before Dimitri called out, "Ah, Claude, wait a moment." The other man turned back to look at him, confused, but Dimitri was already back inside his tent, rummaging for something. He found it quickly, and rushed back out to make sure the other man was still there. As luck would have it, he had not moved a muscle. Approaching once more, Dimitri held his hand out once more. Curious, Claude reached out, and Dimitri dropped what he was holding into Claude's hand. "This is," Claude trailed off. "A dagger," Dimitri responded pleasantly, "for you." Claude rubbed the back of his head. Thank you, but why are you giving this to me? You're an archer, are you not? I noticed that you have few close-range options of your own. I'd rather you be somewhat encumbered than dead." Claude turned it over a few times in his hands. "All right, it's pretty nice. I'll hold on to it." Dimitri was quiet as he thought. "You know, I once gave a dagger to someone I cared for deeply. When I gave it to her, I told her to use it to cut a path to the future. I imagine she took my advice to heart." He stared off into the distance. There's still so much I need to know. Don't vanish yet. I still need you." Claude gave a smile that was more teasing than most. "You've got a strange way with gifts, you know that? If you said that line to anyone else, they would think you were flirting." His eyebrow raised. "I hear that often." "Fret not, Claude, when it comes to you, this dagger is for the teacup." Claude's smile turned brittle. "I don't know what you're talking about, your kingliness." "I'm sure you don't. Just don't forget to bring me a new one. I'm sure Lawrence will have a heart attack the next time I see him if I don't have a full tea set." "Alright. That'll be the day. Say, do you give a lot of people daggers?" Dimitri rolled his eyes. "It's a common gift practice in Faerghus to give a weapon to others. Just, don't ask too many others. The story will get mixed. Goddess knows Sylvain would take it differently." Claude's smile became a bit too knowing for his liking. "Right, I getcha. Won't peep a word about this to anyone else. But seriously though, I do need to get going this time. Places to be, armies to avoid. You know the drill. Right, I shouldn't hold you any longer. Be safe, Claude." The man gave a mock salute and headed on his way. Dimitri watched him go before returning to his own tent, reclining on his own bed with a long sigh. He had not slept well last night. His worry for Shay, his anger from losing his enemies, the stress from the war, all of it had been compounding over time. He feared his psyche may snap if too many of these days occurred back to back. Hopeful, they would only occur once per fortnight, or perhaps once per moon if all went well. Sighing heavily, he closed his eyes and attempted to get some more rest before his duties called. "Your Highness, you are needed in the War Council." With a groan, he opened his eyes and pulled himself up. Time to get to work, then. His weary body deserved no rest in the end, after all. It was difficult to keep track of the words being spoken to him. His dazed and weary mind could maintain the image of attentiveness, but little else. He was truly grateful to have Rodrigue with them once more after his negotiations with the noble houses in Faerghus, and didn't want to appear as a poor host and friend, but even keeping his eyes open was proving to be a challenge at the moment. The conversation naturally rolled over to the war effort. Dimitri relayed the fact that he and Claude had spoken of their plan to draw more troops to the west, and the rest nodded as though it were to be expected. Is it really a good idea to trust him? He's too much of a schemer for my liking, Felix complained. Why yeah, he might be trying to wear us down before taking the war to us. I'm worried he may go back on our alliance and go to the Empire if things go bad. Annette murmured, looking worried. Ingrid frowned. Claude isn't the type to do that, not when we're working towards the same goal. He's the type to maximize his chances of winning, no matter what. Yeah, but, Sylvain began, an uncharacteristically serious look on his face, do you think we would still be in this alliance if we weren't winning right now? An oppressive silence settled over the group, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. Your Highness, are you sure? Rodrigue began, but Dimitri spoke over him. I trust him. Multiple sets of eyes laid upon him, and he almost found himself reeling from the weight of them. He swallowed, and spoke again. I trust Claude. He won't harm us. I believe that, until this war is over, he will be our most stalwart ally by far. His friends were silent for a moment before Ash spoke up. I believe you, Your Highness. Still, though, shouldn't we be careful? Not everyone in the Federation are aligned, and Claude only recently became king. We should prepare for fringe groups to act out. His reasoning was sound, although it pained him to know where it was coming from. I agree. We'll send Gustav and the Knights of Syros an advance warning. For now, however, we march. Ready your units. The kingdom army rushed off, leaving only Rodrigue and himself. So, we are to march on the Empire in earnest. Yes. We must act swiftly. There is no room for error. Your Highness, when the time comes, Edelgard will return to her empire. Do you have it in you to kill her if she continues this pointless war? Rodrigue's words were carefully crafted. He exhaled deeply, watching his breath fog up in the air. If the worst comes to pass, then I will do what must be done. Before that time, I hope to be able to speak with her. Convince her, in some respect, to accept the ideals of others, even if she cannot abide by them. I do not wish to see a world where the weak are trampled and only the strong can prosper. People can grow and change, but they cannot do so alone. To do so, that would be the most lonely existence of all. She is one who has undergone that change. She has grown powerful, and she accomplished everything with her own strength. Do you truly believe that you will be able to sever your stepsister's head? More than my stepsister, she is an old, treasured friend. I severed my own uncle's head, Rodrigue. My hand will not waver now. Rodrigue nodded slowly. Your Highness, please remember that we are all here for you. We will remain by your side until the ends of the earth, and your wish is our command. Dimitri allowed himself a sardonic smile, easily picking up on his words. Rodrigue, when the time comes and I have laid her low, I will not miss. Until then, however, there is still much I need to know. The Empire was involved, in some manner, with the tragedy of Duscur. The men who caused it proliferate her ranks and pollute her people. Because of that, He couldn't finish his thought, could not speak into life the fact that he would likely never be able to forgive her if she had a hand in that day. If she organized it, or perhaps ordered it. He grit his teeth, and continued on. In a way, I can understand her ideals. However, starting wars on a whim, sending countless people to the goddess, regardless of reasoning, that cannot be forgiven. If she refuses to accept a punishment, then I shall force it on her, as king of Faerghus. Rodrigue's smile was sad. I am glad to see that your conviction is unshaken, though I wish it did not have to be at the expense of someone you cared for. That reminds me, I wished to give you this earlier. Rodrigue produced a letter, holding it before Dimitri. Confused, he accepted it, reading the first line. This is a letter, written by Lady Patricia. I uncovered it during my inquiry into Viscount Illadur. Rodrigue's face was notably passive, although he seemed to be gauging his reaction more than anything else. Stepmother, what could you possibly have been doing? He wasn't sure if he wanted to read the letter at all. Rodrigue continued. I have already examined the contents, and although the contents are disturbing, it contains no new information of note. Perhaps it would be best to read it later. I see. I shall do so, then. Dimitri felt rattled. He rode his horse to their next campsite, feeling a need to be alone. The letter had stirred up emotions in him that he did not wish to experience. He had not wished to believe that his stepmother was colluding with those people, wishing desperately that she had simply died an innocent death, ignorant of the assassination. This letter disproved both of those facts. His stepmother had unequivocally been a main contributor to the king's assassination. The letter detailed her wish for the Viscount to aid in her conspiracy against Lambert, how they would both have much to gain from his death, and how she was sympathetic to his reluctance for the king's reforms. Perhaps worst of all was that the letter was entirely authentic. "So, you chose this path, stepmother." Not once had Lady Patricia looked at him as though he were her son. She had always held a faraway look, an inexplicable sadness that no amount of love could pierce. Dmitri remembered this vividly. It was hard to forget when a parent did not love you. However, he did not expect her treachery to go so far. Was her desire to see Edelgard so strong? Would he understand more if he lost a child of his own? No, that line of thinking was best left abandoned. There was no woman who deserved to be tainted by his touch. "Hey, Dmitri. You gonna mope around out there all day, or are you gonna come inside?" Shay's voice called to him from the carriage, and he jolted. He turned to her with a strained smile. "Are you certain you wish for me to join you?" Yeah, whatever, just get in here." And that was how he found himself sitting in a carriage with Shay. Truly, her ways of negotiation knew no bounds. "Hey, I know I just called you in here, but there's something important I need to talk to you about," she said, turning her head uncomfortably. Dimitri's ears perked up. "Oh? Regardless of what it is, I will hear you out. You are a valued friend, after all." She looked to the side uncomfortably, and he got the strangest feeling that he had said something wrong. "That means a lot, Dmitri, because what I have to tell you is important. Like, really important." The look on her face worried him. She usually didn't look so serious. He leaned forwards, giving her his full attention. "So, you know how I, have that power? How it's similar to their power," she began, and he suddenly realized why she was nervous. "Shay, I trust you immensely. I do not worry that you have deceived me. Yeah, I know you don't, but it creeps me out sometimes. I'm worried that, if something went wrong, well, I don't want to hurt anybody I care for." He curled his hand around his chin. "You're worried that you may lose control and harm our allies. I know you trust me, but what would you do if we ended up being enemies one day? Would you cut me down if you had to?" Dmitri thought for a long moment. She seemed genuinely worried about this, as though it were certain to become an issue at some point. How could he best assuage her fears? Could he even do so until their enemies were dead and their world was free? "No matter what, I would never give up on you. I would take you down as many times as needed until you came back to your senses, and if need be, I would restrain you. I won't give up on anyone I care for." She exhaled lightly, her body slumping as she stared at him. "I knew you would say that. You're kinda predictable sometimes, Dmitri. You always aim for the best." "Predictable?" His eyes went wide. "Yeah, you know, you'll always go for the best ending you can. It makes sense, and it's great when it works, but sometimes, it's just not possible." Shay's voice was undeniably sad. "It's always possible, and if it isn't, then through our efforts, we will make it so," Dmitri responded resolutely. "Ha! See, that's what I mean. If you said something like that to Edelgard, she would spit in your face. She's a more realistic type of person, and though your ideals are good, you should really learn to roll them back a bit." Dmitri frowned heavily. "Where are you going with this, Shay? You would not have brought this up without purpose." She stared out the windows of the carriage, idly watching the horses of their men as they trotted to their next destination. "Right after our last battle, I ran into Myson. You know that already. What I didn't mention was that I talked to him." His breath caught in his throat. "Are you all right? Did anything happen?" "Well, when I caught up to him, I wasn't in any shape to be doing any fighting. But that's not the problem. He recognized me, or rather, my power. Not only that, but he thought I was someone else, someone in their organization. I played it cool and he seemed to buy it, but, she trailed off. But what? His mouth was dry. Well, I wasn't sure if you would want to keep me around. What if there are some, like, hidden memories or something that I don't have? What if I wake up one day and act like a completely different person? He seemed so certain that I was that Epimenides person, and I dash. Shay, he bundled up one of her hands between both of his own. If you are confessing to this, then I have something that I must share as well. I am already aware of both that fact, and that name. Her face went completely slack, and she stared at him in abject confusion. You what? When Edelgard and I faced Thales, he used that name to attempt to buy my loyalty, if only shortly. My honest reaction to that information was and still is complete disregard. I couldn't care any less if you have a connection to them. Time and time again, you have proven yourself to be someone trustworthy, someone worth having by my side. If something truly does happen, if we end up as enemies, then I will drag you home, kicking and screaming if I must. I have lost too much to lose you as well. You know, if you took that attitude with a mercenary company, you would be a drunk in a ditch within a year. Don't you think you could be a bit more cautious at times? I just told you that I have a potential connection to them. It would make me feel a lot better if you grilled me or something. Shay's mouth was pressed into a thin line. Dmitri merely shrugged. Perhaps you do have a connection with them. If you are a spy, then I doubt that I would forgive you, but as I see it, this is a chance, an opportunity. We've been at a loss, completely without the ability to determine where our enemy is or even what their goals are. With your help, we can hunt them down and carve them out of the hole they're hiding in. His voice had taken a sharp edge, and while he was aware of it, he did nothing to restrain it. Shay nodded. I already have a line of communication with them. Myson has sent me a missive detailing what I've missed while I was gone. It's, pretty extensive. Lot of Crest experiments, whole lot of corruption, and so much more. She produced the letter and handed it over. He opened it up and read the contents, staring at what might as well be considered runes for how well he understood them. Can you perhaps make a copy of this? To put it plainly, this is indecipherable to me. The letter traded hands one more time, although she looked a bit baffled. Really? It just looks like normal stuff to me. I'll do my best, I guess. Dmitri shook his head as she pocketed it once more and relaxed somewhat. Why did you wait this long to share this, Shay? She gave him a caged look. Hey, it's not that I didn't trust you, okay? I just didn't know who to tell when I found out. I thought you would kill me in this carriage, Dmitri, but I also thought it was worth the risk. She was worried that I would lash out, but shared everything because she was concerned for the safety of her allies. She's truly a commendable person. I think I understand now. Genuinely, I thank you for placing your faith in me, Shay. I promise, I will live up to it. The rest of the carriage ride to their destination was smooth, with the two talking and laughing freely. They were halfway through their conquest of Girth territory when a messenger arrived. Your Highness, urgent news from Margrave Gautier. Dmitri looked up from Shay's translation of the Agarthan texts, frowning. From the Margrave? It must truly be important. Srang is launching one of their largest attacks so far. The Margrave has requested support as soon as possible, sir. Srang. Now? That doesn't. He looked back down to the paper, an impending sense of doom suddenly spiking in his mind. Incite the enemies of Fodlan into attacking at the most opportune time in order to disrupt the war as much as possible. We must strike while the region is as destabilized as possible. He breathed in and out deeply. I will personally go and assist the Margrave. Send word that Rodrigue, Sylvain, and myself will be coming to his aid. Understood, sir. With that, the messenger was off, and he was left to his own devices once more. He rubbed his temples, considering how best to share with the army that he would be departing for a while. While he knew that this was a problem that could be solved with fewer people, the timing of it was too coincidental. If the paper was to be believed, then the Agarthans planned to destroy the Fell Star, also known as the Ashen Demon, by any means possible. While that was being accomplished, they would disrupt and destabilize Fodlan and bide their time until they could easily overrun the continent. They would use their knowledge of crest stones to isolate and extract the blood from them in order to create overwhelmingly powerful weapons for specific people, incorporating their own technology into the ancient prowess of the heroes' relics. The idea was utter insanity, but there was proof to back it up. However, the ideas mentioned here, the fact that they were inciting other nations to attack worried him. With the way the war was going, the last thing they needed was constant worries of another nation overrunning their borders while they attempted to save their own. If any of the three lords allowed that to happen, then the fragile balance of power in Fodlan would collapse. He could not imagine what would occur if Almira, for example, successfully invaded. Almira, they had not made any large moves for a while now, according to his information, but even if they were to make a move, what could he possibly do about it? The kingdom lacked the soldiers to do anything about the issue. And then, a bolt of inspiration struck him. He stood up from his desk in a hurry. They needed to get moving as soon as possible. Rushing through the camp, he found Sylvain easily. He was in the middle of a conversation with Felix and Ingrid, one that he easily pulled him away from. "Whoa, Your Highness, where's the fire? Cool it a little bit, would you?" Sylvain complained as Dimitri almost dragged him by the arm. He found Rodrigue shortly after, speaking to a general of a beleaguered territory. "Rodrigue, we must depart at once." "Your Highness?" Rodrigue asked, somewhat confused. "Sreng has launched another invasion, this one large. We need to suppress it." Sylvain stiffened at his side. The old man asked for help. Dimitri nodded. "Indeed. We do not have time to discuss. We must make haste." He had his own reasons for departing, but those, he couldn't share. There was one last stop he wanted to make before they left, however. "You're leaving for Sreng now?" Shay asked, eyes wide. "Yes. I saw fit to inform you, as you are our chief strategist," Dimitri reasonably explained. "I so what, Felix is in charge while you're gone? You can't just up and drop the kingdom army whenever you feel like it, Dimitri. We've got a major battle coming up soon. We're in the middle of a war zone." She scolded him. He remained steadfast. "This isn't something that I can ignore. Even when we win the war, this will have long-lasting effects if I fail to address it. I am sorry, but this wasn't a request." His voice took on a harsh tone, one that he normally never used with her. Under normal circumstances, he would always prefer to talk it out with Shay, but in a situation such as this one, he could broker no argument. She gave him an annoyed look and huffed. "You're going to stick with this then, huh? Well, fine. We'll manage without you. But you have to win and get back quick, because the men are going to feel your absence before anyone else, and if you don't want this war to start fraying at the seams, you have to hurry back soon." He inhaled sharply, momentarily confused. "Is my presence really that valuable? I find that hard to believe." I see. I promise, I will return as quickly as I can. It is not my intention to abandon the war front just as soon as we reach it." She acquiesced, but was clearly not happy about it. Very, very few were, in fact. Felix gave him a harsh look and a scoff, and Dida was staunchly on the side of accompanying them to their destination. It was only through thorough reassurance that he convinced him to remain. With their goodbyes said, the three men and their battalions rode to Gautier territory. Their journey was not yet complete when Dimitri spoke. "I'm afraid that I must split off for the moment. There is an issue in Fhirdiad that I must address." Sylvain looked at him, surprised, and then a look of understanding dawned on his face. "Oh. An issue, I see. I understand completely. You do whatever you need to do, Your Highness. We'll mop up after you." Somehow, he got the feeling that Sylvain was speaking literally. "I will not be gone long. I should rejoin the two of you before we begin our counter-attack on Sreng." "Ah, don't worry about it, Your Highness, I can keep it a secret. A lot of guys are like that dash." Rodrigue sighed, world-weary and worn. "Sylvain, please keep your comments to the minimum. We will rendezvous with Margrave Gautier then, Your Majesty. Please try not to dally too long." Dimitri nodded, urging his horse off in the direction of his city. The road to Fhirdiad was well defended, and banditry had recently fallen. Perhaps the war had risen it, but he would like to imagine that his own ruling practices were helping to curb the poverty and disease that gave rise to such behaviors in the first place. Had they not been so close to Fhirdiad in the first place, he never would have suggested such a detour. His father died a fruitless death en route to a foreign land, and he refused to die a similar death. He rode into Fhirdiad like the devil himself was on his heels, and the servants within Fhirdiad's castle greeted him warmly. "I greet my lord. Is there anything I may assist you with?" the head butler asked, bowing low. "I must speak with Edelgard and the Ashen Demon." "Ah, bring Yuri as well. There are certain things that we must discuss. I require absolute privacy. None of our words should reach anyone outside of my room." He did not shed his coat, as usual. His newest armor, courtesy of his class advancement to Great Lord, was adorned with the Bladdid crest, and while it had gotten matted on the ride down, now was not the time for rest. "Understood, my lord." "Chamomile tea?" "Not today. I must leave shortly after my discussion." He ascended the steps and made his way to his own personal room, made to host his guests more than anything else. Sitting in one of his chairs, he leaned back and rested his eyes for a moment. The stress he had been experiencing lately was starting to build up. The voices had not fled him while he slept, but in recent days, he had grown better at managing them. He supposed he only had those he cared about to thank for pulling him away from their incessant cries. He opened his eyes once more when the door opened and the Ashen Demon walked in, followed closely by Yuri. "Hello, Your Highness. I was just following up on a lead when I got called in for work. Imagine my surprise when I heard the king himself wanted little ol me." Yuri's voice was charming, but Dmitri did not have the time to play any games with the two of them. "Where is Edelgard?" Yuri's smile didn't falter, and the Ashen Demon remained impassive as ever, aside from a small smile that he attempted every now and then. "Yikes, tough crowd. The princess was in the middle of a very good nap last I saw her. I imagine that songbird that's always by her side is giving your butler some trouble." "I see," he sighed, trying not to let his exhaustion show. He could hide his weariness very easily whenever he wasn't sitting down. "King Dmitri, may I ask what this meeting is about?" Byleth attempted, and Dmitri blinked. Byleth had never been so formal with him before. He would usually speak far more bluntly, but in this case, it seemed as though he were actually paying him respect. "You need not speak so formally with me, Byleth. You and I are not beholden to anything of the sort. As for the purpose of this meeting, well dash." The door slammed open, and on the other side stood a very irritated-looking Edelgard, dressed in her night clothes. "My apologies, Dmitri. Had I known that causing a ruckus was your idea of endearing yourself to me, I would have plugged my ears the night before." Byleth looked as though he were on the absolute verge of speaking, but held back at the last second. Yuri just snickered. Dmitri sighed. "I would not have called you if it were not urgent, Edelgard, and I imagine that this conversation will be of great importance to all of us." The door softly closed behind Edelgard, and she made herself comfortable in a chair, looking the very picture of elegance despite her bedraggled appearance. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling somewhat nervous. Had Claude and Rhea been here, they would have representatives from almost every major faction in Fodlan in one room. He leaned forwards somewhat, adjusting his posture. "What I am about to suggest will not sound like a clever idea, but I also called all three of you here because I have the utmost of trust in you. Wouldn't really recommend that considering who you're talking to here, but go on," Yuri commented. "I have reason to believe that very soon, a group known as the Agarthans will make a major move, and to prevent catastrophe from striking, I require the help of all three of you." Chapter 5, Golden Wildfire Assault on Burgles. Having subdued the Western Church, the Allied Kingdom and Federation armies prepare to launch a coordinated assault on the Empire as part of their gambit to draw out the remaining Imperial forces. As the Kingdom army advances on Girth territory in order to spearhead their advance into the Empire, the Federation prepares their own schemes to deal with Count Burgles, unaware of the danger growing at their backs. Claude hunched over the war table, frowning at the situation. This isn't that good. Looking at it objectively, his chances of winning an outright war here were low. He wasn't one to brag, but the fact that the Federation was even still in this fight was probably just due to his schemes. He'd managed to keep the Empire off their tail at every moment that mattered, and in the future, he would do his best to make sure that it stayed like that. The problem now arose with the troops massing at the Ermid. It hadn't been long since Dmitri had begun his assault on the Western Empire, and that had only drawn away a few troops from the group. If things kept up as they were, the Empire would swarm over the border and plow right through the Great Bridge. He couldn't launch an attack, either. Going over the Great Bridge and trying to make a dent in the armed forces stationed in Gronder would be like putting his men through a meat grinder. Say what you would about the Empire right now, but their military might was nothing to scoff at. It was unsustainable, but nothing to scoff at. The problem is that, if they managed to break through and whittle down both the Federation and Kingdom, then this Thales character could probably take down all of Fodlan in one go. Besides, even assuming they managed to bust through the troops huddled outside their doorstep, they still had to deal with Count Bergliez, their ever-present problem. Claude wasn't exaggerating when he told Dmitri that Count Bergliez could match Holst blow for blow. Holst had years upon years of experience battling against the Amirans at Fodlan's throat, and even he said that he wasn't sure who would win if they fought. Bergliez was more bear than man. That meant that, unfortunate though it was, the Federation was stuck just waiting to be obliterated if they didn't do anything. Getting troops from any of the other 5 great lords was like pulling teeth. Ordelaya physically could not provide any, and Edmund was absent from every other meeting, but Goneril and Gloucester now thankfully had their positions filled with people he could trust and relatively easily manipulate if need be. Lawrence was genuinely dedicated to the future of the Federation, and Holst was willing to help him because Hilda was willing to help him. His side of things with Regan was stretched thin enough as it was. So, all things considered, he was stuck. Couldn't let them over, couldn't break through them. He wasn't the only person who noticed the problem. Judith was nearly as shrewd as he was and usually approached the war table with a frown these days. If he were any other tactician, he would call the situation bad. Unfortunately for the Empire, he was Claude von Regan. He had a plan for this situation. He'd long expected something like this to happen, and he had a contingency that didn't involve unveiling his closest held secret to the rest of the world just yet. The kingdom's forces were causing a major stir to the west. He could easily say that they were drawing the majority of the Empire's attention, good thing, too, because he needed them away from him for the moment. If this was going to work, he needed the Empire distracted and weakened. They only had a short window to pull this off, and if it didn't work, the Federation would be swallowed by the Empire in one fell swoop. It wasn't exactly the most bold or original plan he had ever made, but it was something that he was certain would work. The door to the War Council swung open, and he stepped back with a small smile on his face. Yeah, this would go well. There were only a few factors that he could account for that would change the outcome. He was alone in the war room for now, so having someone to bounce this idea off of would be nice. Turning to greet the new arrival, his heart dropped into his stomach. Oh, hey, Judash. Why have you been avoiding me? Did something go wrong? Her voice was sharp, and a small sense of shame filled him. I wouldn't go that far. Before you left, you explicitly told me that you would kill King Dmitri, didn't you? I don't care if you changed your mind, but you can't keep making harebrained decisions like that without consulting anyone. It's not that I changed my mind, just dash. Just what, Claude? You keep flip-flopping between what you want to do with the kingdom. First you say you need to get rid of their king so you can strike at the church, and next thing we know, we're in an alliance with them. You leave for close to a week to do the same thing, and all of a sudden, their battle tactics get a lot better and Dmitri is still alive. If you truly want to ally with them, then drop the pretenses and just commit to it. Her verbal lashings were rough, and he felt chastised as he watched her cross her arms. I was thinking about the world after the war. Thinking about what killing the enemy leaders would mean. It was premature of me to try and kill them without a plan. All I wanted to do was remove the church and its heavy influence, not destroy Faerghus and its people. I definitely left with the intention to do what I set out to do every time, but both times, I got too caught up in the future. I'm sorry for misleading you, Judith. I won't let it happen again. Judith sighed, rubbing her temple. Kid, I'm not scolding you because you changed your mind, I'm scolding you because I'm worried about you. You've always jumped into things recklessly, even when you had a plan, and you've never backed down like this before unless it was part of some elaborate scheme. Claude let out a short laugh. I have faith in Dimitri. He won't be a problem when it comes to getting rid of the church. That's really all I need to know about him. Judith stared at him for a long moment before sighing and crossing her arms again. Well, I'm glad you've found someone you can rely on in the kingdom. I wish you hadn't sent away 3 of our commanders, but it's good to see that look on your face. He tilted his head. Last I checked, I look the same as always. Is it that obvious that I made another friend? Judith shook her head. I wouldn't say that, but you look a lot more relaxed these days. It's a good look on you, kid. I'm happy for you. It won't mean much if we can't survive this next attack, though. He nodded. So you noticed, too. The enemy has more troops at the Eremid than they need. Any day now, they're going to launch an attack. Luckily for us all, I've come up with a plan to deal with that. Is this a plan or a scheme? How about you tell me the difference first, and then we'll decide. Your plans are usually made in about 30 seconds and give me a heart attack. Your schemes are usually ingenious and well thought out, but are crafty to a point of causing problems. So, which one is it this time, kid? Well, Claude, I do not find this plan of yours to be wise. Be quiet, Laurence. Am I not allowed to express my distaste for this plan of ours, Hilda? It reeks of danger. Look, Laurence, it's not the worst plan I've ever had. I fail to see why you require the presence of the great Laurence Helman Gloucester for such an inane mission. We've been over this, Laurence, we need you for your fire magic. You're the best in the business when it comes to that. But Hilda has a point, I really need you to be quiet for a bit. Under normal circumstances, Laurence's talkativeness was an annoyance at worst. However, that did not apply when they were miles deep in enemy territory and all 3 of them were underneath the floorboards of a barn with footsteps above them. See, Claude's plan genuinely did not suck this time. Some of his plans, well, they could potentially use some work. Maybe. This plan, though, wasn't awful. Morally, it may not have been one of his best, but tactically, he doubted it could be any more sound if he tried. See, it went like this: Claude needed a way to get the enemies off of his back for a bit, just long enough to buy time for the Kingdom Army to loop around and give them some aid. There was, unfortunately, no way to guarantee that without sabotage. Doubly unfortunately, infiltrating the enemy forces would be nearly impossible under normal circumstances. That meant that they needed a distraction. And that was why Judith was now leading a pitched hit-and-run attack on Empire soldiers in the middle of the night. By all rights, this would be seen as a light skirmish and nothing more. But to the Empire, it would be a renewal of hostilities, something they had held off on for the past few days, specifically for this plan. He had let them rest, let them recuperate, let them simmer in their unease and their worry at the utter silence from the Federation front. It was also that, when they did hit again, it would warrant a more dramatic response. The soldiers would be more envigored, more willing to fight against them. And, well, if they're willing to fight back, then that means that they would be less observant when it came to some of their more important supply stations. They were blowing up their food stash. That was all it boiled down to. If he really hated them, he would poison it, but he wanted the breadbasket of the Empire for himself, if he were being honest, and that type of animosity wouldn't do him any favors in taking the territory from Count Burgles. After close to an hour of hiding themselves in bushes and crawling through the mud, Laurence, Hilda, and himself were now directly beneath one of their biggest grain supplies. Laurence was very obviously directly helpful. He was needed for his fire magic, something that Lysithea had less skill in if it didn't mean blowing everything up. Hilda was less obviously useful, but she still had her purpose. It was better to imagine her as a brick wall separating Laurence's constant nagging from Claude's sanity. If he ever felt like he was going to lose his mind after one more noble speech from the man, all he had to do was look at her and see her smile, and magically, things would feel more manageable. Of course, there was also the fact that she was freakishly strong, and could likely be the defining factor behind their escape if things got messy. Still, though, this was a tough spot. They were only a step away from their goal, and there were just a couple people above the floorboards chattering away in the dead of night like there was no attack on them. Worry began to gnaw at his gut. It was irrational, he knew, but was there a chance that Judith had fallen already? They hadn't been gone that long, but even the strongest of people could fall to an unlucky accident. Not everything had to end with fire and brimstone. A dagger to the heart could be just as fitting an end to a warrior as any. No, he decided he had to have faith in her. That old bat wouldn't leave him like that. She'd nag him with a foot in the grave. Leaning in really close to his ear, Hilda breathily whispered, "Claude, if we don't get on the move soon, I'm gonna flip." He shuddered at the close contact, his eyes darting to hers. In this close space, they were practically sharing their own breath. It would have been a lot more overwhelming had her smile not been so utterly plastic. It then occurred to him that for the last hour, he had forced her to deal with Lawrence's bickering, crawling through dirt and mud, and heavy lifting, all things she absolutely abhorred doing. When her eyes opened and seemed to laser their way into his skull, he decided that he would rather die charging at the Imperial Army than underneath a barn. "Lawrence," he stage whispered, looking up and jerking his head upwards. The purple-haired man stared blankly back at him. After a few more futile seconds of attempting to do the bare minimum to signal what he wanted to do, he just let out a sigh. "Hilda, just break it." He let out a sigh. "Thank you, Claude." Her words were sweet as cotton candy, and just about as bad for the body. Even in this confined space, with little room to move around, Free Kugel slammed into the floorboards above with a massive boom, and in the resulting chaos, the three of them pulled themselves out from beneath the floor. The two guards were easily put down with 2 arrows from Fail Not, and he turned to Lawrence. "Light it up, now." Their time to do this was low. They could theoretically pull this off if they only managed to light this one, but there were 3 major silos that they needed to burn. 1,800 soldiers, that's the estimated number stationed in just this area, even with Judith drawing a lot of them away. There are only 3 of us. Have I made a mistake? Should we retreat? I probably shouldn't get greedy. The door burst open, 5 heavily armored men rushing into the barn just as Lawrence finished casting his spell. Before any of them could react, Hilda rushed forward, Free Kugel sliding a harsh line across the 3 of them and sending them crashing through the other wall of the barn. Lawrence looked back to them, and Hilda gave him an expectant look. "Where to next, leader man?" "Yes, Claude, we must make haste, especially now that we have alerted the enemy." "No need to worry about your safety, of course, I will not hold back in showing them the might of Lawrence Hellman Gloucester, ho ho ho." Momentarily surprised, he stared at the 2 of them. Even in a situation like this? "Ha," he laughed, closing his eyes and running a hand through his hair. "It's weird to be trusted like this. It feels almost disingenuous. I know I've been manipulating them from the start, but I'll take us to victory, so just follow my orders." It certainly felt inspiring when he said it. Both Lawrence and Hilda gave him such wide smiles that he could almost believe it himself. Still, he knew just how bad this could go without a detachment, or backup, or any kind of support. 5 minutes later, almost wading through a sea of soldiers, he could very easily see the difference between this and a normal battle. They couldn't bring any of their mounts, so they were just 3-foot soldiers trying to take out 3 vitally important areas of the Imperial Army's strongholds. It was, in layman's terms, a fool's errand. An idiotic idea, a daisy pusher's ploy, whatever words you wanted to use for it. Still, though, with Hilda and Lawrence at his back, he never felt like he would die, at any point. Isn't that funny? 600 to 1. The odds were abysmal. No gambler worth their salt would bet on them in a million years. And yet, Fail Not twirled in his hands as he shot down incoming soldiers, sometimes 3 at a time. The hero's relic worked wonders in his hands. At his left, Hilda's Free Kugel turned whatever was in front of her into mincemeat, and most of the time, she did the same to whatever was behind that, too. At his right, Lawrence chortled as he twirled his lance, magic suffusing the air and drawing in enemies before he sent them flying. Despite everything, despite the odds, he felt invincible. The second storehouse is just ahead. We can't let up. Do try to keep up, Claude. I am afraid that our king will be outshone by his vassal if you do not put any more effort in. Hilda laughed, the sound wild and free. Oh, are we keeping track now? I thought you didn't care about the numbers after Murden. We do not speak of the incident at Murden. Lawrence went a deep red, and Claude let loose a deep laugh from the bottom of his belly. If you really think you can keep up, then do your best, Lawrence. I'm not gonna take that lying down, you know. Claude smirked. The three of them fought their way to the second storehouse, and just as before, it went up in flames. Claude exhaled quickly, trying to keep his focus sharp. How many does that make now? 100? 150? There are still a lot of enemies. And then, a voice rang over the battlefield, and his blood ran cold. I was wondering who had snuck in. Turns out it's the king of the Federation himself. Guess I'll get the chance to test your mettle today. That voice, it was familiar, in all the worst ways. His head whipped to the right, following the source. Count Burghley's dash, he gritted out, and then the man moved. Before any of the three could react, the man had rushed in, and a blade gauntlet was rushing towards Claude's face. His eyes went wide, and it was only years of training that allowed him to just barely sweep himself to the side enough to avoid it. A devastating kick landed square in his stomach, and spittle came flying out of his mouth as he was sent skidding backwards. There was no time to recover, however, as the bear of a man was upon him once more. The man was beyond a master in close quarters combat. Had Claude not faced off against Holst in training, he would call him the best. It was beyond difficult just to hold his ground, let alone retaliate. He would never be able to knock an arrow, and bowmen were supposed to hold an advantage over grapplers and the like. The Count was just that good. However, something had to give, and it was Claude who gave first. His footing had been struck awry by the Count's careful attacks, and he was reeling from narrowly avoiding death too many times in a row. He couldn't retreat anymore, and if he tried, he would fall, and most certainly die. There were no more options for him. Hilda and Lawrence were desperately fighting their way to him, but the Count's personally trained soldiers had them held up. They couldn't make it in time. You are an archer, are you not? I noticed you have few close-range options of your own. I'd rather you encumbered than dead. Fail not fell from his hands, and he earnestly gripped the dagger at his waist and met Burghley's strike head-on. For the first time in their skirmish, steel met steel, and Burghley's eyes widened, pressing down on the small weapon with an almost unbearable strength. That weapon is of Faergon make. So it's true that the Federation and Kingdom have joined hands. The Count narrowed his eyes, detaching from Claude and jumping away right as Hilda's axe slammed down into the ground right where he used to be, a large shockwave erupting over the clearing. There was fire and brimstone in her eyes, and for once, he thought she looked better when she was serious. The dagger went back onto his waistline, and he picked up Fail not once more. Thanks for the assist, Hilda. Hey, Lawrence. You go handle that last storehouse. We'll hold him here. Lawrence whipped his head Claude's way, a worried expression painted on his figure. Are you certain that you do not require my aid? This foe is not one we can take lightly. Your mission is more important than ours, Lawrence. We have to win this, for the sake of the Federation. He knew that bringing in the country would push the man towards making the decision that mattered, and true to his prediction, Lawrence acquiesced after a short moment, dashing off in the direction of the last storehouse. Bold of you to assume that two whelps can keep me here. The Count had a calculating look on his face. Claude didn't blame him. Facing down two heroes' relics on your own was a daunting prospect for anyone. He allowed himself a small smile as he knocked an arrow. Well, we'll see about that. Hilda, I'll back you up. Ah, Claude, are you sure I can't just cheer you on? I'm just a weak little waif. Don't pit me against this meanie. Count Burghley scoffed. I recognize that hair. You're a goneril. Weak is the opposite of what I would call your family. If I kill you here, maybe Holst will give me the challenge I seek. The Count kicked off once more, and the battle was on. The soldiers around them remained a threat. Taking his eye off of them was a fool's errand. He would have to constantly try to keep them in check while keeping Burghley's off of Hilda. The things he did for the Federation, honestly. Speaking of Hilda, she was already having trouble. Her strength was undeniable, certainly. Her every strike was likely powerful enough to cleave the Count in two. However, she was running into the same problem he was. Count Bergliez was a war master, and he could chain together attacks and elements constantly. To call him a perfect warrior wasn't too far from an exaggeration. In comparison, Hilda was slow. She could get a hit in edgewise every now and then, but it was only thanks to Claude's meddling that she stayed in the fight, and he meddled often. After yet another tense clash, Hilda backed off and slammed her axe into the ground, the earth itself seeming to erupt and launch nearly the entire legion of soldiers surrounding them away. Bergliez, of course, blocked the attack with his gauntlets. "You're making me work," she growled, her voice low and raspy. He noticed that her hair had fallen from its normal bun and was now cascading over her shoulders, and a thin line of blood trickled down her head. "Something has to change. I have to take control of this situation. Fail not, blot the sky with your arrows. Fallen Star." The relic weapon trembled in his hands as the pure, condensed magic formed, firing straight upwards and creating a pure orb of magic that hovered in the air. Within seconds, before Bergliez could reach them, a hail of wind-ensconced arrows erupted from the orb, almost completely covering the ground with its power. Claude and Hilda retreated, breathing heavily, and they watched as Count Bergliez got just out of reach of the magic. The wind whistled and howled as Bergliez stared at them from across the way, huffing. A bead of sweat rolled down his neck. Fallen Star really was amazing for his purposes. It created a complete zone of denial on the battlefield for a short while. Nobody could enter without becoming a pincushion. In a situation like this, it was invaluable. Only problem is that Bergliez could kill him before he recovered enough to use it again. "Come on, Lawrence, hurry up." They'd only been fighting for about a minute and a half, 2 minutes tops. Fallen Star could grant them maybe 15 seconds at most. He'd loaded it with as much magic as possible, so it should hold for longer than normal. If Lawrence finished in, maybe, the next 2 minutes, they could all escape unscathed. "Claude, how do we deal with this guy?" Hilda's voice was quiet. Free Kugel hung in her hands, and her eyes were unusually focused. "We don't have to beat him to win. Just focus on staying alive," he responded back. Just in time, too, because Fallen Star's effect ended. Bergliez moved like a man freed from the eternal flames he set upon them with a fury yet unseen. Hilda met his initial blow with a lightning charge strike, causing so much destruction that Claude was reminded just why he wanted her on his side. And yet, even despite that, he was undeterred. Just what the hell is this guy made of? He fired 5 arrows in quick succession, cutting off Bergliez's best angles of attack, but the man managed to find a hole in all of their strategies. Hilda was once more forced on the defensive, and he could see her struggling, doing her best to not get stabbed by the man's claws. "Come on, think. How can I get out of this?" Desperately, he drew back his bow and executed another combat art he knew well. The arrow burned, and as he fired, it left behind a trail of sparks. "Hilda, duck." She hit the ground instantly, and the arrow exploded, leaving Bergliez covered in a cloud of smoke. He didn't believe for a second that was enough to kill him, and neither did Hilda, because she started rolling away instantly. It was a good call, because a blade gauntlet slammed down where her head was only a few moments ago. "You brat, you think this is enough? I'll dash." "Hilda, he's disoriented." Now. Determined, Hilda hefted her axe. "Free Kugel, let's bring him down." Apocalyptic flame. With a deft burst of flame, her axe rocketed forwards, slamming into Bergliez's gauntlets and jutting them away from his body. With his guard broken, Hilda reared her hero's relic back and slammed it onto the ground, a massive pillar of flame erupting right onto Bergliez. Was that enough? There was a lingering feeling of doubt echoing in his mind, telling him that it wouldn't be enough. It was unsubstantiated, but he had to ask himself if that would be enough to take out Holst, and the answer was a resounding no. "Hilda, get out of there!" he called out desperately, and not a moment too soon she glanced at him and back up, and his warning was the only thing that gave her enough time to dance backward and avoid getting killed by Bergliez's counter-attack. She returned to his side, panting heavily. "What's this guy made of? This, isn't natural." Burgleys heaved a hefty sigh. You kids aren't half bad. Guess I see why the Alliance trusted you so much. But I can't let you leave here alive. Hilda laughed uneasily. You don't think you can cut us a break? You know, there is a pretty girl in front of you, all sweaty and exhausted, don't you think we can find something better to do? Claude just looked down at her, exasperated. Of course that was the tactic she would use. It was perfectly on brand for her. Unfortunately for them, the Count didn't bite. I'm happily married, you harlot. Don't tarnish your family's name with your actions. He patted Hilda on the back sympathetically. It was a good try. Shut up, Claude. Hey, no need to get feisty. I'll show you feisty. And I will show you home. Hilda's eyes widened, and the Count swore, craning his neck behind him because directly behind him, the third and final storehouse of food was burning. From behind, a set of horses approached, and Claude had never been quite so happy to see the most annoying man he had ever met. Claude, Hilda, jump on. The other man called, and Claude didn't argue. He instantly hopped up on the horse and pulled Hilda up behind him, and they set off before Count Burgleys could respond or catch up. The last the three of them saw of the man was his snarling face as he ordered their paladins to try and catch up to them. Hilda's arms were snug around his waist, and he had to force himself to concentrate. Lawrence, did you steal these? I realize it may have been uncouth of me, but I did, yes. It was my understanding that the two of you were insufficient to deal with Count Burgleys. Okay, harsh, but true. I'm proud of you, Lawrence. Baby's first crime. Claude smiled wearily. Lawrence scoffed. Hardly. My first crime was abandoning my friends in their hour of need. That almost sounded cool, Lawrence. Hilda chimed in, her voice rumbling in her throat, pressed tight against his back. He shivered. The adrenaline must have been making him hyper-aware of his surroundings. From behind, a group of paladins approached, but Lawrence was unshaken. Allow me. His lance flashed out, and fire erupted forth, burning the road behind them. The horses of the paladins reared back, suddenly afraid of the fire, and the trio continued on unimpeded. The darkness seemed to grow thicker as they trampled their way out of camp, and although there was no need for it, he felt the need to have fail not in his hands. With this, they were essentially home free. Honestly, now that they had exited the camp and the range of most of the soldiers, they were fine. All they had to do was meet up with Judith. Until he looked back, and saw Count Burgleys riding a horse and rapidly catching up to them. Persistent bastard! He swore, urging his horse to go faster. Claude, what is the plan? Lawrence asked, also looking back and seeing their adversary. I have no idea where Judith is. She could be anywhere, even executing another attack. I have to save myself here. We're going to the Great Bridge. Even Count Burgleys can't survive if he becomes a pincushion. The Great Claude, we are miles away. This plan is infeasible at best. Right, well, I don't fancy our chances when he almost took the two of us out on his own and took a direct hit from Hilda without a sweat. We have to run, Lawrence. And run, they did. Burgleys' horse was probably his own personal horse, born and raised for perfection. Considering all of that, it was impressive that the horses they acquired from the Empire could outrun it at all, especially with a greater load. But their pace was unsustainable, and Burgleys' wasn't. The horses were starting to flag, and all the Count had to do was catch up to them once. That being said, there was a way to avoid the issue. Lawrence, you can split off if you need to. The Count is only after us, there's no need to have all of us die here. Claude, you are right, Claude, there is no need to have all of us die here. In fact, there is no need to have any of us die here, because I refuse to abandon you to die while knowing that my presence can direct the battle in our favor. Lawrence's voice was harsh, and a pang of regret echoed within Claude. Was I too charismatic? I don't really want Lawrence to die here. Someone should be able to pick up the reins of the Federation once I'm gone. I don't exactly plan on dying, but I can't exactly plan for victory, either. Anyway I view it, we're. In that case, how about we fight? Hilda offered quietly, and Claude's heart almost stopped. Hilda, suggesting we fight? I never thought I would see the day, Claude joked, and she punched him in the back. He groaned quietly. I'm serious. You never would have suggested that if you thought we could get away. So, how about we just hold our own here, and see what happens? He glanced back at her, hoping to see some doubt in her eyes, hoping to see that she was joking, that she was just playing her usual pranks, but there was nothing. She was just staring up at him with the same eyes as usual, those two trusting eyes that made him feel awful every time he saw them. He grit his teeth. Fine, then. We'll fight here. He jumped from his horse, Hilda right behind him. Burgles pulled to a stop and jumped off the horse as well, the business end of his gauntlets already ready. Lawrence reared around, pulling himself to the front. In a situation like this, we have the advantage. A horse was a powerful battlefield tool. It granted presence, reach, and speed unmatched. Combined with Lawrence's magical abilities and general adeptness at using a spear, and they had a very valid brick wall between themselves and the Count, not to mention the fact that Lawrence was the most uninjured of them by far. You kids stupid or something. If you wanted to die, you never should have gotten on the horses in the first place. Without any more preamble, the Count launched himself at the trio. With Lawrence now in the battle, the tide had shifted in their favor. The Count had enough time to recover from some of the damage they had dealt to him, though, and was still a major threat. But still, goddess above, the man refused to die. His gauntlets could be stuck between Lawrence's spear and free Kugel, and he would still find time to dodge Claude's arrows. It was pure insanity, and it showed him how painfully far he had left to go as a warrior. The fight dragged on for 1 minute, then 2. His exhaustion was starting to hit him, and Fail Not was starting to quiver in his hands. Lawrence rushed in on his horse, striking once, twice, and thrice. Hilda jumped in from above, slamming her axe down and causing an eruption of dirt and stone. From afar, Claude continued to fire, but his quiver was running noticeably dry. We don't have time for this. Fail Not, one more time. Fallen Star. The magic went off successfully, the orb firing into the air and spinning successfully. Lawrence and Hilda jumped back to his side, well familiar with his weapon's power by now. The horse that Lawrence acquired whinnied softly and pawed the ground, looking stressed. Its owner did not look much better. Claude, if ever we were to run, now would be the time. Just hold out, Lawrence. We'll win this. He replied grimly. This guy is such a pain. I just want to go home and take a bath. Hilda complained, crocodile tears pouring down her face. Claude grimaced. For once, he had to agree with her. Please, let this be enough. This was his final plan, his last Hail Mary into the darkness. If this plan failed, they were dead in the water without a paddle. The Bear of Burgles looked winded, but that was all. He was facing 3 of the Federation's best, and he still wasn't going down. Who back home could even beat this guy? Lysithea has the raw strength, but not the speed, same goes for Raphael. Leonie could keep up once she gets warmed up, but he would splatter her before she got the chance. We can't rely on Holst to solve all of our problems, because eventually, we'll have to fight stronger enemies. So then, who? Who could win this? There was really only one answer. Burgles met them with unrelenting force once Fallen Star ended, almost as if he was even more fired up than before. It was all they could do to keep up. Raphael would love to know this guy's training regimen. Lawrence's spear caught the very edge of Burgles' gaunt face, and a thin trail of blood began to run down his cheek. Despite the absurdity of it, a sense of victory ran flush through him. We might be able to do this after all. But, despite the small victory, it would still never be enough. Hilda was noticeably flagging. He wasn't doing much better. Too much intense action for too long was starting to affect his concentration, and his arrows were beginning to wander to the left or right. Even Lawrence looked like he was feeling it, his eyebrows drawn up into a tight line as he cast magic to keep the bear out of their way. Unfortunately for them, Burgles just took the magic and kept going. Even Lawrence seemed shocked as Burgles ran right past him. He's going for me. The realization sunk in quickly. Desperately, he began to hop backwards, knocking another arrow and waiting for the opportune time, when he was too close to dodge. Claude fired, and Burgles knocked the arrow aside in midair. His eye twitched. This guy is ridiculous. Who has the reflexes for that? Waldemar taught me a thing or two about dealing with archers like you. Burgles laughed, and his gauntlet raced towards Claude's chest. Desperately, he pulled out the dagger once more, preparing to defend himself however possible, but this time, he got the sinking feeling it wouldn't be possible. His eyes danced around, searching for a weakness, but in his panicked mind, he found none. I'm going to die here. It seemed almost unreal, impossible. Claude had long since understood that it was possible to lose a battle like this. He'd expected to die on a battlefield in the name of some worthless location that didn't matter. He just never thought it would be, today. Burgles' eyes went wide, and he suddenly danced backwards. A sword rocketed down on where he was just standing, and a burst of relief filled him as he drew breath one more time. Judith looked at him, worry etched into her expression. Sorry I'm late, kiddo. Won't happen again. He inhaled sharply, just savoring the fact that he was still alive. It happens to the best of us. Burgles huffed. The hero of Daphnel, 2 crest-bearers, and Count Gloucester. I'm strong, but I'm not foolish enough to continue a fight I know I can't win. You win today, King Regan. Before any of them could chase him, Burgles whistled for his horse and rode off back in the direction of his camp. Watching Count Burgles run away was like hearing the wind of a storm stop. Finally, for the first time that night, he felt like he might be all right. His legs wobbled, and he practically fell onto the ground. Wiping some sweat from his brow, he looked up at Judith. Thanks for the save. We couldn't have won that without you, he admitted. But Claude, you said that we would win. Multiple times, might I add. Lawrence complained. Yeah, well, that was all really hanging on Judith seeing Fallen Star and coming to help. I rolled the dice and just happened to land Snake Eyes. Letting his legs rest after a fight like that was almost euphoric. Judith stared at him, her expression unreadable. Kid, you could stand to include others in your plans more often. You had no idea how worried I was. He tensed his shoulders, feeling oddly defensive. Hey, I included you as much as I could. It would have been impossible without you. That's not what I mean and you know it. When you make a plan like this, you always assume that you'll be able to complete your goals flawlessly, without trusting others to do the same. You assumed you would be able to quietly sneak in and light up the storehouses before Count Burgles could react, but he moved faster than you expected, didn't he? If you had shared the finer details with me, I could have helped you avoid that mistake. Claude broke eye contact with her, choosing to stare at the ground. How could he even justify himself here? It was impossible to tell her something like, I can't bring myself to trust you, because she was his mother's closest friend. And the worst part was that he did trust her, but something within him refused to let her get any closer than an arm's reach. Every time he shared a plan, shared his inner thoughts or his worries, it felt like he was giving a piece of himself away, a piece that would never come back. Whatever, look, we won, so can we go home? I want to go to sleep. Hilda complained, leaning almost her entire body weight onto Free Kugel. Judith's eyes wandered back to them. I've got some people coming, so hold on for a bit. Kid, we are absolutely going to talk about this later, so don't think you can weasel your way out of this. Claude let out a small sigh. They rode into the Great Bridge a victorious party, having succeeded in all their goals. The Empire would hopefully be set back weeks, and that was far more than enough time for the kingdom to blaze their way over here. If everything went according to plan, then they would be fine for a while. At least, that was the hope. One of the factors that he couldn't account for was King Regan. We have an issue. A messenger rushed up to him, and he sighed. All right, where's the fire? Tell me what's going on, without missing anything. The Empire is gearing up to attack, sir. Their soldiers are marching to the Great Bridge as we speak. Claude let out a sigh. Well, that wasn't too outlandish. The Empire was actually probably ready to take the Great Bridge whenever they wanted. The reason they held back was because they wanted a cleaner win. Destroying their storehouses of food was liable to do one of two things: force them to back off to the breadbasket of the Empire, Burghley's lands, or force them to try to resupply using Federation lands. Evidently, Count Burghley's was confident after their little bout. That's fine. Holst is on his way, right? And no, sir. He sent a letter recently, sir. The Amirans are invading. His heart dropped to his stomach. What? Ugh, those barbarians picked the worst time they could to invade. Lawrence turned up his nose, and Claude stifled the spark of irritation within him. Claude pinched the bridge of his nose. All right, focus. Holst will be tied up with keeping the Amirans out. He wouldn't have rejected my request if it wasn't serious. How large is the invading force on the Almiran front? It's larger than any we've faced before, sir. So Shahid has made his move. Damn. As much as I doubt it was intentional, he sure picked a hell of a time to attack. What about the kingdom? Can we expect any reinforcements from their end? The messenger quickly shook his head. Sir, the kingdom is locked into a similar conflict. Srang have recently launched a large-scale invasion of their own. Their forces are divided. The king and Margrave Gautier are in the north, and the rest of the forces are in the west invading Girth territory. Gods, what a mess. Maybe it was intentional. So we'll have to handle this ourselves. Understood. Claude, what's the plan here? Hilda's voice was uncharacteristically worried, and he turned to look at her. She couldn't meet his eyes. She must be really worried about her brother. He raised his head, inhaling deeply. Was there even a way to resolve this? Both of these forces would require their whole might to repel. Unless. Send another letter to Holst. Tell him to make his way here and abandon his forces at Fodlan's Locket. I'll go to hold it myself. Have the rest of the Federation's forces amass here, at the Great Bridge. No matter what, this location cannot fall. Repel Count Burghley's and his men at all costs. Lawrence, while I'm gone, you're in charge. Claude, what are you doing? This plan is madness. I cannot allow our king to put himself in danger like this. Lawrence, predictably, protested. Relax, Lawrence. I understand your worry, but I have a plan. Don't worry about me, I won't die here or there. Judith crossed her arms. Kid, you remember what we just talked about, right? If you're gonna do something harebrained again, then we're here to help stop you from falling. Claude gave her a sad look. Sorry, Judith, but this is one thing that I have to do on my own. I would love to have the rest of you there with me, but the way things are now, it's just not possible. I'll make you a promise now, I'll definitely come back and see you all again, no matter what. Hilda pouted. You better not die. His smile became more real as he tousled her hair, ignoring her whines. Of course I won't die. Who else would do all of your hard work if I died over there? Before he could say or do anything else, she suddenly pulled him into a hug. I'm serious, Claude. We need you. I'm serious, too. I'll come back. I promise. In some aspects, he was confident in this new plan. In others, he wasn't. Their deal with the kingdom had been beneficial for both sides. The kingdom had sent them large swaths of troops and steel, so he was confident they could defend the Great Bridge. In return, they had only lost 3 commanders. All in all, it was an even deal. But the troops they had could never defend both the Great Bridge and Fodlan's throat at the same time. It was one or the other. He chose to repel the Empire, because he had an option, a hidden ace up the sleeve that nobody else had, that nobody else even knew he had. He could easily pull rank as Prince of Almira and take over command of a large group of the invading Almiran troops. Nader would hand over command easily, even gladly. It would still be a pitched battle, but it was something he could win. It was possible. And, if it wasn't, then, well, he had a scheme for that, too. There would be a future for the Federation, and for all of Fodlan. He would ensure it, at all costs. Chapter 6, Azure Gleam Flames of the West, A Hidden Hope. Lord Frildarius, there's Dash. My lord, over here. Lord Frildarius, we need your presence, Dash. Felix ignored all of their words, brushing through the door to the War Council. While he was sure that their inane problems would be solved if he did actually show up, he just couldn't be bothered right now. They were on the cusp of a major battle, and he was still being asked to solve minor disputes between foot soldiers. It wasn't hard to discipline them, so he failed to see how the men under him couldn't accomplish that. That's why he preferred to fight alone. A battalion at his back only distracted him. His eyes scanned the war room. All members accounted for. The original members of the Blue Lions stared back at him, minus a few faces, and the Federation forces looked up at him inquisitively. He let out a small sigh. With the Boer gone, he was forced to take command in their blitz of the Western Empire. It wasn't something he couldn't do, but that didn't mean that he liked it. It was frustrating not having the Boer, Sylvain, and Felix's own father with them. Cutting down on their commanders could only hurt them in the long run, not to mention the forces they brought with them. Good, everyone's here. Let's start the strategy meeting. We'll be up against houses Girth, Essa, Loken, and Oaks all at once. We'll need to account for their forces. Ash began, a furrow to his brow. There's also the chance that Count Hevering will send reinforcements. We'll probably have to fight against Linhard again. Annette's voice was a bit sad. Felix's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he forced them elsewhere. Let us not forget that one of our old teachers from Gareg Mach Monastery is part of House Essa. We may have to face against Hanneman, and with him, Manuela. Didier rumbled. Girth territory once absorbed Novelli territory, so Constance will likely be here as well, Mercedes sighed. Felix sighed. We can't get caught up in the past. If we can, we'll talk them down. If we can't, then we cut through. There'll be time to grieve for the fallen and for our decisions later. Surprisingly, it was Mercedes who nodded. Felix is right. We can't let ourselves be dragged down by our worries. I would love it if we didn't have to fight them, but sometimes, there's no solution aside from fighting. I wish it didn't have to be that way, but some people just can't see reason. Ingrid agreed, nodding along. Shay coughed uncomfortably, looking up at them from her chair. Remember, to these people, we're the invaders. We should try to at least think about the other side a bit. They aren't beasts who can't speak our language, they're just people who want to live in peace, who just happen to live in a place with leaders who want us dead. We can only devote so much time and energy to trying to convince them. This battle will probably be a lot harder, and a lot longer, if we do. But, if you're all certain of it, then we'll talk down whoever we can. Felix redirected the conversation. If they spent too long thinking about the morals of their actions, they would lose heart, something he wanted to avoid. If morale was low before the battle, they would all suffer for it. Annette and Mercedes furiously nodded along. Ignatz chimed in. We've got a few more options past that. Raphael, Marianne, and I talked about what we can do to help in the upcoming battle, and we came up with a few ideas. He nodded. I'm willing to hear them. Anything will help us here. Marianne spoke softly. Ignatz offered to bring in soldiers to sabotage the enemy, Raphael offered to assign some brawlers to help defend us, and I suggested we bring in healing supplies for each of our strongholds. Feliz hummed, crossing his arms and staring over the map of the battlefield. We'll be fighting for a protracted period of time, and this is a big battlefield. All of those are decent suggestions. Shay was the one to speak up. We'll take the brawler unit. We have enough healers and supplies, and having more fighters to defend us will always be a good idea. Glancing around, he saw nobody raising any complaints, and he exhaled softly. In that case, it's settled. We'll focus our strategies around preserving as many lives as possible, and we'll bring along a brawler unit. If there are any complaints, speak up now. We're not coming back to this once we're done. Silence reigned supreme. After a few seconds, he continued on. On to the details of the battle itself. Our scouts confirmed that there are about 3,000 soldiers pooled in this one area, so if we take out around 2,000, we should be able to secure the area for later. Speaking of strategy was one thing, executing it was another. The battle was going well at the start, too well. The Empire's forces were collapsing like paper to water. He knew it was a trap. It was obvious. Still, though, They had no choice but to spring it. They had easily taken the strongholds on the outskirts, with their slower fighters working their way through the outer edges in preparation to work their way inwards. The gates to the main plaza had opened, revealing the enemy commander to be Monica von Oaks, the Emperor's lapdog. He was honestly shocked to see her here. He thought that if the Emperor was gone, she would vanish from the Empire, but apparently she just went home. It wasn't until she retreated twice and he pushed inwards twice that he realized his fatal error. A trap was sprung. Imperial reinforcements launched themselves from the sides, and from afar, Hanuman began to rain down resonant magic upon them. As the situation stood, he remained in the center with Ingrid and Didu, the latter of which had been recently promoted to Great Knight. Around the outskirts were Annette, Mercedes, Ash, Raphael, Marianne, and Ignatz, quite literally the only commanders they had at their disposal. He didn't know what the boar was thinking with the Empire troops and the Ashen Wolves, letting them run off like that. "Felix, we need to fall back. This is too much for us," Ingrid yelled, barely avoiding an arrow on her Pegasus. Felix grit his teeth, dashing forwards and slicing into the first archer he found. It was always like this. Ingrid focused too much on the whole state of the battle, but she missed the trees for the forest. If he wasn't there to protect her, she would get overwhelmed in a situation like this. "We can win. Don't let up early." He fought like a madman, dodging attack after attack and feeling the cold wind wrap around him, increasing his speed. He tore through enemy warlocks, refusing to allow any of his allies to fall. Viscountessa had joined the battle as well, and though he was a relatively competent lord, he wasn't on the same level of skill as Annette when it came to magic. It was easy to avoid his slower magic and cut through. It was only after a few tense minutes of battle that the onslaught of resonant magic ceased, and the doors to the enemy strongholds began to open to provide more reinforcements. Baron Oaks was their next target, and Didu pulled Felix up onto his horse as they charged for the northwestern stronghold. "If we take him down, we'll be able to move on. This should draw the enemy commanders out. We'll strike quick and hard." Baron Oaks put up a valiant fight for his daughter and his country, but just like all the rest, he fell before their combined might. Ingrid, Didu, and himself were far more than any normal fighter could handle. The combination of sword, lance, and axe were enough to disrupt anyone who sought to break through them, even if it was a bit uncomfortable between the three of them. But here was where the real issues arose. Resonant magic rained down upon them once more as Monica took to the field again. They locked eyes from across the row, and Felix tightened his grip on his sword. "Ingrid, Didu, help me clear them out and then leave me to fight Monica. I can handle her myself." Monica von Oaks was a crest-bearer with a sacred weapon. He held the Aegis shield. Its comforting weight on his arm consoled him, reminded him that he would be all right regardless of how many enemies there were. He dashed forwards into combat, and her ferocious face was all that met him. Magic lashed towards him at a ridiculous rate, and his shield weathered what his body couldn't weave between. He struck out towards her rapidly, his sword searching for holes in her defense, but she dodged backwards, and with a chant, dark magic instantly sprouted up around him. With a deft dodge, he barely managed to avoid it, but a cyclone of fire followed it. Having trained with Annette on many long sleepless nights, he knew how to handle mages, but Monica was putting out more than she should be able to, chaining together magic and spells that should be nigh impossible for a normal person to safely use back to back. "Where is your king? Where is Dmitri Alexander Bladdid?" she hissed as his sword cut through one of her magical attacks. "He's busy. It's not like we'll need the boar's help to take you down, anyway," he goaded, watching as her expression contorted into something monstrous. Behind him, Ingrid and Didu rushed past, and Monica's eyes followed them for less than a split second before focusing back on him. "If I kill all of you here, then that'll draw him out, right? He's the type of guy who would get mad if I killed all of his friends, right?" Her voice was tinged in desperation, in long, forlorn madness, and he scoffed in disgust. "How about you just focus on staying alive first? I don't have time to argue with madmen." Her pupils dilated, and she raised her tome. His eyes went wide. That magic! Pure dark magic erupted from the ground below, with the intent of swallowing the world whole. It brokered no defense, and aimed to curse and destroy every good bit of light it touched. Shrieking creatures scrabbled and consumed every bit of purchase they could find, and an aura of pure pain rolled over the clearing. That was the true meaning of the purest dark magic of all, Hades, the spell that sacrificed in order to draw open the gates to the eternal flames if only for a short moment. With this many dead bodies around, there was no better time to cast it. And as the dust settled from her almighty attack, Felix was still standing, leaning on his sword as he stood. The Aegis shield shook on his arm, and the bottle of a concoction clattered on the ground as he finished drinking. What? You survived. Monica looked genuinely shocked, and extremely rattled. I'm not someone you can kill. Not today, not ever. Don't count on winning this fight. He lifted his sword, and adjusted his footing. Monica shrieked as she fired off spell after spell in his direction. Each one was negated or dodged. You killed my father, you killed my emperor. And for what? Your king, your country, your stupid ideals? You took the only people I loved from me, and now you expect me to just roll over and die? To the eternal flames with you. Just die. Her body flashed with magical power, and he scowled, dashing forwards with his full speed. Before she could finish her spell, his sword accurately slashed outwards, and the tome was ripped from her hands, scattering unceremoniously to the ground. She looked almost surprised by the development, falling backwards from his forward momentum. She looked up to him as he leveled his sword at her neck. The battlefield was tense and quiet for a long moment, before she spoke quietly. Just kill me. Felix tilted his head, and Monica kept speaking, hiccuping as tears rolled down her face. Just kill me. I have nothing to live for anymore. You took Edelgard. You took my father. Please, just kill me. Just do it. Felix let out a long-suffering sigh, removing his sword from her neck. He began to walk in the same direction that Ingrid and Didu had gone, his stomach flipping at the absurdity of the situation. What are you doing? Don't just leave me here, kill me. I'm your enemy, aren't I? If you leave me here, I'll come back and kill you. I'll kill you, and your father, and your king. Damn it, Frildarius, get back here. If you want to die, then don't drag me into it. I don't like having to deal with loud women. Besides, he turned his head to the side, letting out a sigh. He spoke once more, and Monica's eyes went so wide he feared they would pop out of her skull. What? Are you is what you say true? I don't like to repeat myself. Either do what I said, or get out of my sight and never come back. I'm sure Linhard and Constance are on their way, too. If you know what's good for you, you'll retreat and let us have this battlefield. She averted her eyes, looking down. He sheathed his sword. Look, we've won this day. Hanuman has stopped using his resonant magic, and that means that Manuela is out of the battle, too. They were your last line of defense, right? We're still not done here, but you can leave whenever. I don't care what you do, but don't bother me or my friends anymore if you are not going to help. Hesitantly, Monica glanced towards him and the northernmost stronghold before scooping up her tome and rushing away from the battlefield. Felix sighed, suddenly exhausted. As much as he would like to say that the woman had given him an easy battle, it would be far from the truth. Without the Aegis shield, he wasn't sure if he could have made it all the way through. Still, though, no point in thinking about that now. He would just have to train harder. Rushing off, he approached the northern stronghold, where he met up with Annette and Mercedes fighting against Duke Girth and his last vanguard. Monica had been their last ace in the hole. Girth had no crest, no special weapon that tilted the battle in his favor, no outrageous training to level the playing field. He was a man with magic, and they had two of the kingdom's best against him, alongside Felix. Duke Girth fell with a choked cry, and Felix's sword found the man's heart. He stood back up to full, watching as the last of the soldiers scattered. We did it, huh? Annette commented breathlessly. Mercedes hummed, looking understandably worried. We can't rest on our laurels. We won today, but there's no guarantee we'll win tomorrow. We have to keep getting stronger. Felix spoke aloud, staring down as the Duke lost the light in his eyes. A feeling of emptiness washed over him. That hadn't been an even fight. The kingdom held an overwhelming advantage. Their troops were organized, their commanders stronger and more numerous in number, and their morale higher. They were fighting for a purpose beyond defending their home, a home that was being led by madmen. It had been nothing but a slaughter. He detested war. Felix watched with a detached curiosity as the boar rode into camp, Rodrigue and Sylvain at his back. His expression lightened when they locked eyes. "Felix. It's good to see you again. I've seen the reports, but I'd like to ask how the battle went." His response was clipped. "It went fine, boar. We managed. I see you were successful, too." The proof of it was in Sylvain and the lance of ruin strapped to his back. The man sheepishly waved to Felix. "Come now, Felix, surely you can give more details than that. Was the plan successful?" "Dunno. I just sent them on their way. Who knows if they ran from the fight or actually went where I told them to." Dimitri's expression softened. "Thank you, Felix. I have faith in them, there is nothing to worry about." He crossed his arms. "I'm still not okay with this scheme of yours." "You don't have to be. I just ask that you have faith in me." Felix spit to the side, and Rodrigue frowned. "Your Highness, perhaps it would be best to have this conversation elsewhere. I'm sure we are all weary from our efforts." Felix shook his head. "Don't bother, I'm done talking, anyways. Go needle Schaefer the details." He ignored Dimitri's hurt look and stalked off, heading for the training grounds. He knew it was predictable, that if he really wanted to hide, he should go somewhere like the library, but there was a festering feeling digging deep beneath his skin that he desperately felt the need to burn out. He stomped up to a training dummy and began to lash out. His sword moved in fast flashes of light, the sunlight reflecting off of the shiny blade and dancing around the training grounds. Just earlier that day, it had been bathed in blood. Some squire had taken his sword and shined it until it reflected. It sickened him that the proof of his misdeeds could be scrubbed off with just a washcloth. Thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women had died for this pointless war. Families had been torn apart, people and friends and brothers had been lost. It was hard to justify your cause when you saw a child crying for their parents in the middle of a burning street. He knew that things couldn't change without this war hell, he knew that they might not even change just to spite it. He was fighting to save his country, until he wasn't. It was really convenient that there was an underground society manipulating everything, he thought. Really convenient to have a scapegoat to pin the blame on, to say, this was necessary to kill these people, and just wash your hands of the war. Really convenient when you can raise your hands in victory, knowing that the only things you had done was kill and kill and kill for a cause that wasn't really tangible, for a peace that may or may not exist. How would Edelgard justify her war when it was all said and done, he wondered. Would she pin the blame on Rhea as she had been doing? Make Thales out to be some mastermind when it was her actions that caused so many men and women to raise up arms against each other, for so many people to lose their families? Say that the crests are to blame, as always? The crests which people couldn't choose, could never choose, the roles they had been born with as protectors and killers? Or maybe she would coat it with a few honeyed words and tell them that she had done it to get rid of that system where they couldn't choose. It pissed him off. His sword reflected in the waning sunlight. He stared at his reflection in it, noting his tense expression, his pinched eyebrows, the amber eyes that seemed to be staring at nothing in particular. How similar to his father he looked. How pathetic he looked. Maybe Edelgard had a point, he thought. Maybe the church really was the root cause of all of society's problems, and maybe, if they got rid of it, they could all hold hands and live peacefully and everything would be daisies and roses. What would happen then? Would it all be worth it in the end? Could a lasting peace truly be built? In the end, it didn't matter, did it? That woman would never stop unless she was killed. She would scrub her sword until it shone if she wasn't stopped, ignoring the rancid smell of blood that stuck to it that would never go away. He hated her. Hated her with all of his heart. Hated how she had brought this upon them, forced them all to fight a war that none of them wanted, forced them to wade in blood and wake up biting back screams in the middle of the night. Hated how she brought out the kindest smiles and the calmest eyes in the boar, hated how the man defended her until his last breath. Hated how Dimitri wouldn't let him kill her and end this madness. The head of the dummy came off, and Felix huffed angrily, moving on to the next. 2,000 soldiers. That was the goal they set out on when they made their push into Girth territory today. It was the only way, he told himself. The only way to make sure that their soldiers wouldn't be ambushed by any remaining enemies. They killed 2,000 people today. 2,000 brothers and sisters, sons and daughters who would never be going home. A future robbed from the good and the bad. When the news of Glenn's death had come home, it felt like his world had come crashing down. Ingrid had completely locked herself in her room, distraught at the news, distraught at the fact that the man she was growing to love, the man she was set to marry, was dead. Felix didn't know how to comfort her, he didn't even know how to comfort himself. Dimitri was a complete wreck, he had lost far more than just a night in the tragedy. In the end, it had been Sylvain to carry them, limping across the finish line towards recovery. Sylvain, who every day had verbal and physical abuse thrown at him by Miquelon, was forced to babysit 3 kids who had spiraled into grief. And, in the end, even Sylvain wasn't immune to trauma. He coped horribly, sleeping with every woman he could get a hold on, spiraling into self-hatred and building misogyny that he refused to speak of or even act on. Had Ingrid not been there, he would have been a far worse person. That was the weight of a single life. They took 2,000 just today, and had taken far, far more previously. He had watched as a girl had begged him to kill her today. Watched as the last bit of hope fled her body, and watched as she realized that he had taken the very last things that mattered to her in this world. If he hadn't offered her a lifeline, if he hadn't held a way for her to survive, she absolutely would not have lived to see that azure moon rise tonight by his hands or otherwise. If the situation was reversed, if he had lost his father, had lost Sylvain and Ingrid and even the boar, would he have done the same? Would he have charged into battle, looking to die? He wanted to say no, but he hadn't lost them yet. If he endured the same fresh pain he felt after losing Glenn so many times in a row, who could say that he wouldn't break, too? So what was the point? What was the point of fighting this war, when the course of it could be decided over afternoon tea? The boar had the key to ending it right in his hands. He'd held the answer tightly, and he had looked Felix in the eyes and asked him to have faith in him, and he'd let that answer fall from his fingertips willingly. He should have killed the boar the second it was let out of its cage. "Felix? Are you okay?" A soft voice echoed from behind him, and he stopped swinging his sword. He turned and gave her his full attention. "Annette. What are you doing here?" She shuffled her feet, refusing to meet his eyes. "Well, His Highness was worried about you, so tch. I should have figured. He didn't have the spine to face me himself, so he sent you. Well? Out with it. What does he want?" He couldn't blame the boar for not wanting to see him right now. Felix himself couldn't decide if he wanted to remove his head or not. Annette went a very lovely shade of red, and he realized that he was probably being too harsh. "Excuse you, nobody sent me. I came to look for you because I was worried about you too, you ass. You looked really shaken up after today, so I just wanted to check," she trailed off, noticing the look on his face. "Well, I found a way to spend the rest of my afternoon. And what if I wasn't okay? What could you possibly do for me if that was the case?" Annette frowned. "Felix." He turned away from her, focusing back on the training dummy. "I don't need your help, so go back and cook, or whatever it is girls like you do in your free time." He didn't have to look at her face to know exactly what expression she was making. She was pouting, with her eyebrows drawn tight and her eyes wide from the sheer force of her anger. She was holding her breath to keep from outright screaming at him, and she was clenching her fists tight, keeping them by her side. Then, when the dam eventually burst, she would lead with, "Felix Hugo Frildarius, that does it." Exactly as predicted. She caught him by the ear and began to drag him away. He had already sheathed his sword in preparation for this. He complained, but didn't fight back. That would be impossible against someone like her, for multiple reasons. "I am going to show you how a girl like me spends her day, and you are going to like it." Somehow, he knew that her words would certainly be ringing true by the end of the day. Claude arrived at Fodlan's Locket to an explosion of activity. He dismounted from his wyvern, giving the poor girl a few minutes of rest. She would need it before this battle. King Regan, thank you for coming. We need your guidance desperately. The Amirans have pushed through 2 checkpoints already. A Federation general approached him, and he nodded solemnly. So they were around halfway through the locket, then. Considering Shahid's ability, this was about what he expected. Without holes to guard it, the Amirans had gotten cocky and pushed deeper than they should have. We don't have much time. Activate the ballistae, ready a detachment of soldiers, and prepare for a focused rush into the southernmost checkpoint. Set up traps in the southernmost checkpoint behind our soldiers. I want every other soldier either manning the walls or defending the center checkpoint. I'll be attacking the northern checkpoint alone. Burn the bridges behind me, I don't want to get crept up on. I have my wyvern, so I can always get back. His orders were swift and curt. Set up traps? But Sir Dash. We can't risk losing another checkpoint. It's do or die out there, General. If our soldiers fail to break through, then we want our stronghold to the south to remain standing. If they succeed, then we'll work on breaking the Almiran invasion from there. He retorted sharply, and the general fell silent, bowing low. At your command, sir. Claude sighed, watching as the general set out to follow his orders. Truth be told, he wasn't expecting the southern attack to work. It was just a diversion. He was sending those troops to die. It was meant to prepare the central region and divert Shahid's resources. His brother was a fool, and this strategy was certain to work. Shame that he had to lose those soldiers, but that was why he was sending a small group. He needed as much manpower to survive as possible. In the end, it was just a numbers game. His numbers were a lot lower than Shahid's, so he would lose. That was what it boiled down to. If he treated these people as any more than numbers, then he would lose the mental battle, too. Regardless of the acumen of the commander or the advantageous terrain, 100 men could not beat 100,000. Not that the situation was that bad, of course, it was only something like 10,000, but that was still a solid chunk of the Almiran army. By all rights, holding this area would be impossible. After a few minutes of logistics, he mounted his wyvern once more and patted her back despite her wailing groan. I know, girl, it'll be all right. Just hold out for a little while and everything will be okay. He'd really pushed his wyvern a lot lately, riding around Fodlan like he was on a normal sightseeing tour. He'd been to so many places and seen so many people that he would be surprised if he hadn't learned about them and matured during the process. The unrelenting spirit of Faerghus, the indomitable will of Adrestia, and the limitless concord of Leicester. He'd taken a piece of each with him, something he was sure that his brother lacked. It was why he would never sit upon the throne. Shahid was too concerned with glory, with military achievements and successes, that he was failing to develop as both a person and as a king, and Claude would be sure to punish him for that failure. Nothing topples arrogance quite like believing you've won and then still losing. He would have to borrow some of that unrelenting spirit the most today, though, because, things weren't really looking too good. Holst's chosen soldiers were strong, almost crazily so. But, as he said earlier, strength doesn't really mean much in the face of overwhelming numbers. The Amirans had gotten a bit further than he thought. The Federation soldiers assaulting the second checkpoint were struggling to fight their way through the waves and waves of soldiers pouring from the stronghold. At this rate, they wouldn't even buy enough time to set up the traps that were supposed to take out a few hundred in one go, and there wasn't anything he could do from where he was. He was already crossing the bridge, and disrupting this plan wasn't possible. From behind, the bridge burned, and Claude breathed in deep as his wyvern soared into the entrance of the second stronghold, and he prepared to meet Nader once more. The older man looked visibly surprised to see him fly in, and Claude greeted him with a wink and a wave. Kid, what are you doing here? I heard that the Empire was attacking your lands. Yeah, well, this seemed more important. I kinda need to be here right now. Claude responded, the soldiers around Nader visibly relaxing upon seeing that he wasn't their enemy. Kiddo, your brother is off his rocker. I'd love to help you out here, but I don't have the support I'd like to have. Most of the troops here are on his side, and I'm worried we'll all get wiped out if we try to rebel for you. Nader's concern was reasonable. Shahid's army was huge, and Claude had accounted for that. That was why he blew it off without any concern. Yeah, that's what I figured. I came here expecting that, actually. Nader's eyes narrowed. Kid, whatever scheme you've cooked up better be good, because even I'm not seeing a way out of this. He turned his eyes skywards. Nader, I'm not going to return to Fodlan. It took Nader a second to understand, but when it clicked, it clicked. Kid, you dash. I'm going to make it seem like I died here against the overwhelming Almiran invasion and go home to become king of Almira. When everything has blown over, I'll come back and apologize. For now, though, there's no other way. You can't be serious. You've fought your whole life for this. I know, Nader. I know. But I've left capable people behind, and I know they can take the reins for me. There's no other way around this. Trust me, if there were, I would have thought of it. All I'm here to do today is to kill Shahid, and go home. His voice was somber as he thought of all he was leaving behind. That budding comradeship with Dimitri, the hope he left behind with the Federation. Well, if this is what you really want, then I won't be the one to tell you no. Nader's voice was unmistakably sad, and Claude's heart panged at the sound of it. In some deep recess of his heart, he had hoped that Nader could talk him out of it, that the man would have the resources or troops to save the day. But, in a situation like this, there was no hidden hope, no third option that could save the day. With his heart now resigned to its fate, Claude set out, exiting the stronghold without firing a single arrow. He would need them all outside of it, after all. Almost as soon as he crossed the way to reach the first checkpoint's northernmost stronghold, he was under attack. Arrows split the sky by his wyvern, and soldiers rushed below him, aiming to strike when he was brought low. In a situation like this, fail not, let's bring them low. Fallen Star. The combat art launched into the sky above, arrows raining down from above and clearing the stronghold of men within seconds. Fallen Star was a defender's worst nightmare. It was impossible to dodge the magical arrows that rained from the attack. Unfortunately for him, there was no point to taking a stronghold here. His job was to lose. Besides, this area was just a connector between the stronghold Nader was staying at and the first checkpoint. There was no real significance to it. He pressed on anyway, heading south. He had engineered this scenario specifically to encounter Shahid as easily as possible. He felt bad about sending the Federation soldiers to the slaughter, but there was nothing for it. A Pyrrhic victory was still a victory. Fodlan's locket may fall by the end of the day, but the Almiran invasion would end before Fodlan was damaged in any capacity that he was certain of. If he knew his brother, which he figured he did, then Shahid would want to be as close to the action as possible without actually endangering himself. That probably placed him in the south, and with Claude taking a stronghold to the north, he would become enraged, and they would meet in the center. They would clash, Claude would take a hit or two, kill Shahid, and then Nader would swoop in, kill Claude in revenge, and smuggle him away to Almira where he would become king after the old man finally kicked the bucket. Then, he would shake hands with Dimitri once or twice and Fodlan and Almira would have everlasting peace. Easiest plan he'd ever built. And entering stage right is Shahid. Claude thought as he made eye contact with his brother, approaching the center of Fodlan's locket. You! How dare you disrupt my hour of glory? I'll kill you for this. Shahid frothed at the mouth, and Claude gave him a characteristic wink, ignoring the way his stomach roiled. Well, you can feel free to try. With that, the battle was on. Shahid, despite all of his flaws, could hold his own against some of Fodlan's better fighters, if we assume those fighters to be someone like Ignatz. When compared to Count Bergliez, he was slower even though he was on a wyvern. Not once did Claude feel threatened as his own wyvern practically danced away from his blows, firing arrow after arrow at him as a swift counter-attack. Shahid scowled at the fact that his obviously incredibly powerful and overwhelming assault was easily stopped by an arrow or three, and barked some orders for his men to keep attacking Fodlan's locket, which suited him just fine. Still, though, he had to put up the pretense of caring. His wyvern fired a few fireballs in the direction of the land bridge, completely blocking off the men's advances for a moment. He glared at Shahid. I'm ending this here. Shahid sneered. You swine, wipe that look off your face. To call their battle a battle could be somewhat insulting. It was closer to a snarling cage match than anything. Their wyverns fought physically in the air, clawing and scratching at each other, and Claude had to maneuver carefully to avoid getting bisected. His brother was hell-bent on taking him out, and they were long past the point of negotiation. Time and time again, they clashed, and Claude was getting somewhat tired of constantly having to avoid arrows coming from below. Fail not, once more. Fall and dash. Before he could finish his words, however, Shahid struck out, quick as a viper. He was forced to dodge or risk taking a hit too hard to ignore. Fail not trembled in his hands as the magic was forced to disperse without resolution, and Claude scowled at the interruption. As though I would allow you to complete that. I've heard more than enough about your land's petty relics. I will defeat you without one of my own, and prove my worth as the future king of Almira. Shahid snarled. Claude managed a shaky smile. Oh? And who told you about mine? I'd love to bite his ear off if you gave me a name. Ha! And what use is a name to a dead man? Shahid went on the offensive once more. Damn, this is, actually a bit of a problem. Under any normal circumstance, Claude could win pretty easily, but he was constantly being hounded by the soldiers down below, and his wyvern was beginning to flag. He trusted this creature with his life if she went down, then so did he. Their battle raged for a few minutes more. Shahid, having only really trained as a formality, was beginning to get winded, but it was nothing compared to what had been done to Claude. Long, snaky rivers of blood poured from his wyvern, and she made warbling noises as she flapped her wings. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore, and he knew she couldn't take it anymore. He dismounted, and she flew away. He watched her go, sadness in his heart. That would probably be the last time he ever saw her. Now that he was grounded, his chances were far worse. His wyvern couldn't spit fireballs anymore to deal with the ground soldiers, and he had lost a whole lot of mobility. The ground soldiers, almost exclusively axe users, were eyeing him up with hungry looks in their eyes, itching to dig into him with their weapons. Shahid leered down on him imperiously. Why don't you go and die, already? He approached from the air, raising his axe, and preparing to cut Claude down. Claude, in return, raised Fail not, ready for anything. Shahid drew in close, and Claude closed his eyes, ready to kill his brother. He let loose the arrow, and when he opened his eyes, he was met with his own brother's wide expression as he stared at him, an arrow lodged firmly in his neck. His wyvern careened, slamming into the ground and leaving a long trail of upturned dirt. The soldiers around him stared, almost in disbelieving awe, at their fallen commander. From the north, Nader approached, his eyes spewing fire and his mouth spewing curses, all directed towards him. While none of them were real, it was still painful to see someone who had cared for him as a child yell like that. Nader approached, along with most of the men around. Spinning in a circle and firing, he cleared the way for Nader to arrive and land a clean hit, taking out almost 30 soldiers with a single move. Nader raised his blunted axe, and they locked eyes for a moment. There was an undeniable grief set into his features. Yeah, I feel it too. Fodlan's locket had probably fallen by now. There was no saving it, not against a force this large. Before he was sent into oblivion, he turned his eyes towards the previously fortified position, wondering how many Federation forces had been able to escape. And right before he expected his vision to go dark, a pillar of flame suddenly erupted from the locket. Nader paused, rearing his axe back and turning towards the commotion. Before he could react, an assassin, quick as lightning, had crossed to the central island and landed in front of Claude. What? Did the Federation send these forces? But that flame couldn't be from Hilda, so. He locked eyes with the assassin, and the light purple startled him. That face, he's with the kingdom. Yuri Leclerc winked at him, a roguish smile on his face. Hey, Mr. King. Good to see you here. Something caught root in his heart, something he couldn't identify, a feeling that overwhelmed him and made him start feeling things irrationally. If this guy is from the kingdom, then that means there's only one person that can be. There's only one person who can make a flame like that. From the top of the walls of Fodlan's locket, Emperor Edelgard leered down on the invading forces, and she raised her axe. Her voice rippled over the battlefield, so full of power and prestige that he found himself failing to believe that she had ever been injured at all. Black Eagle Strike Force, move out. And somewhere deep within Claude's heart, a hidden hope took root once more. Edelgard is now playable. Byleth is now playable. Yuri is now playable. Check the description for the links to the author.